If you like the story, you can support the author on Patreon. Link is in the description. Additionally, if you would like to request novels and access my Google Drive where I have 200 plus audiobooks, then you can join my Patreon. Link is also provided in the description.
Chapter 41. Tanya held out a hand, catching a black snowflake in her palm and watching it melt into a murky grey puddle. Who would have guessed that the pollution from her fleet would produce such a dramatic effect in snowy climates? She looked out across the sea, spotting a tiny dot of white in the distance that slowly grew as her ships drew ever closer. Zhao loved to imagine this moment. He was always theorizing what words historians would use to describe him as he brought his fleet to the northern tribe's doorstep. She reminisced, drumming the fingers of her uninjured arm on the railings of her balcony. I don't think he ever considered that he would not be alive to see his dream become a reality. Yet now that I stand in his place, I find myself pondering those same questions. How will history remember this day? She looked aside at the companion standing by her shoulder. What do you think, Prince Zuko? Zuko huffed grumpily, glaring at the ocean as if it had personally offended him. Who cares what they say? All that matters is capturing the Avatar. Tanya smirked sardonically. Come now, Zuko. Is capturing the Avatar really all you think about these days? All work and no play makes for boring company, you know. A strong work ethic is an admirable trait, but it's healthy to take breaks for rest and relaxation now and again. Don't tell me you never took a day off during your search for the Avatar. Zuko's only answer was an annoyed huff. Tanya rolled her eyes. Yeesh, no wonder you turned into such a grump. Once we return home victorious, the first thing I'm going to do is take a nice, long holiday somewhere warm and exclusively for rich people. You wouldn't believe how much an admiral makes these days. You? Away from the war. Zuko huffed disbelievingly. I'll believe it when I see it. Tanya pouted fiercely. How rude. How many times have I told you that all I've ever wanted was a quiet, comfortable life somewhere safe and peaceful? You make me sound like some kind of war maniac. People who value peace and quiet don't tend to lead invasion forces. Zuko countered. Well, it's not like I had much choice in the matter, was it? Tanya shot back. I was born a firebender, and that means mandatory military service for those not born rich enough to weasel their way out of it. If I must fight in this war anyway, better to do it as a commander than as a common foot soldier. Zuko shuffled his feet awkwardly, and went quiet for a moment. When he finally spoke up again, there was a hesitant note to his voice. Hey Tanya, if you didn't have to be a soldier, what would you be? Tanya looked back at him, narrowing her eyes curiously. What do you mean? It's just that I can't imagine you being anything else. Zuko continued. You've always been such a gifted firebender, and a natural strategist. When we were young, you seemed like you were born to be a warrior. He looked out across the ocean. But if you could have chosen the path your life would take for yourself, what would you have picked? Tanya frowned at him. Iroh has been rubbing off on you. Just answer the question. Fine, fine. Tanya closed her eyes and took a breath, savoring the sea breeze. If you must know, I've always wanted to be a merchant. A merchant? Zuko parroted, unable to keep the surprise out of his voice. That's right. A smile grew across Tanya's face, but unlike the sharp, savage grin he usually attributed to her, this one looked far more gentle. Serene even. It would be a much more efficient use of human resources to run an organization that aims to make and sell useful products to the world, rather than throw people against enemy spears. And with all the colonies we've created, the opportunities for a new, golden era of businesses is limitless. If you think my military strategies are good, just wait and see my marketing strategies. I'd be the richest woman in the world within a decade. Zuko scoffed, torn between disbelief and a strange sense of sadness. In his head, Tanya always had been the terrifying, ruthless demonette he'd met as a child, and his every interaction with her had only enforced that belief. Yet that Tanya was the product of conscription laws enforced by his family. His imagination could picture a different Tanya, one who'd had the freedom to choose her own life, with startling ease. A Tanya who used her sharp wits to plot cash forecasts rather than battle formations. A Tanya who grinned maniacally as she crushed competing businesses, rather than as she executed enemies. A Tanya whose hands bore the rusty smell of coins, rather than the scent of blood. Tanya stared at the ocean, a faraway look in her eyes, before suddenly snapping back to reality. Well, it doesn't matter. It's just a dream. She announced. What matters is what we make of our reality, and mine is to be the admiral who conquered the north, just as yours is to be the Fire Lord who captured the Avatar. Speaking of which, you'd better go and get ready. We'll be arriving soon, and for the plan to be a success our timing must be perfect." Zuko nodded and walked away, only shooting a glance back as he reached the door. A part of him couldn't help but feel a stab of guilt at the sight of Tanya, a girl younger than he was, standing alone at the head of an iron fleet. How many other Tanyas in the making were there in his nation? How many of his people had been turned into the warriors they never wanted to be by the commands of his ancestors? "When I'm Fire Lord, I'm going to give my people the freedom to choose back. I swear it," he promised to himself as he stepped forward into the darkness of the ship. Aang wiped a hand across his head, wincing at the grimy sensation the black snow left against his palm. He pulled his hand back to examine the grey smear across his fingers. This black snow was unnatural, something that should have never existed in this beautiful world, and he could not help but think it an omen of the future the Fire Nation sought to bring. Would they stain the rain black too? Fill the sky with dark clouds all across the world? Did they not understand that they'd be blocking out the very sun they drew their own strength from? The stillness before battle is unbearable. Such a quiet dread. Chief Arnook murmured, staring out across the city from beside him. Aang couldn't help but sympathize with him. Minutes ago he'd painted marks across the foreheads of Sokka and other young men as he sent them on a mission he knew very well they may not return from. It must be horrible to have to speak orders that sent his own people into mortal danger. "I wasn't there when the Fire Nation attacked my people." Aang clenched his fist as a spike of resolve shot through him. "I'm going to make a difference this time. The water tribes need an avatar now more than ever. I won't fail them. I swear it," he promised to himself as he looked up at the black flecked sky. "Here at last. Agnikul. Tanya muttered to herself as the city of ice loomed into view in the distance through her spyglass. The capital city of the northern water tribes, and the only settlement that could allow safe entry into the Arctic wastes beyond it where the other smaller settlements resided. It was said that the city had first been built as a show of unity between the originally independent water tribes, long before the schism that saw many tribes migrate to the South Pole. Its location made it the one and only economic hub for foreign countries to trade with the North Pole, and as such it had quickly grown to become the biggest of the northern cities and the seat of the northern tribes' power. An inspiring story, but also a glaring weakness for the northern tribes. Whoever controlled Agnikul controlled the North Pole. None of the other settlements had bothered constructing major defences of their own, content in the idea that Agnikul would serve as a barrier between them and any foreign threats. Once the Fire Nation captured it, however, they would immediately control all the trade routes between the other cities, cutting off much of their communication and allowing them passage directly into the other settlements. Without this one city, the North's resistance would crumble. One of her commanding officers marched up behind her and snapped to attention. "Admiral, all ships are in position. The White Dragon is awaiting permission to advance and test the waters." Tanya lowered the spyglass and tapped it against her chin in thought. The northern tribes will be mustering their defences, and if everything Zuko has told us about the Avatar is true, he'll likely be eager to do his perceived duty. There's a good chance he'll be deployed to sink our first ship in an attempt to deter us. "Should we not send it out then?" the commander asked. "We will. It's important we check for traps before committing our full force." Tanya handed him the spyglass, then stepped up onto the railings of the balcony. "But it would be remiss of us to not give the esteemed Avatar a proper welcome, now wouldn't it?" Fire erupted from her feet as Tanya took to the sky, hovering in place for a moment. "Signal the White Dragon to begin their advance, then take over command of the fleet for me for a few minutes. I'll be joining the White Dragon to make sure we give the North a proper introduction." "You're going to fight the Avatar?" "Admiral, I must insist against this," the commander replied urgently. "Your arm has yet to heal, and we need you to oversee the fleet. There can be no invasion without you." "I know," Tanya replied, a wild grin spreading across her face. "But you'll have to forgive me for a little showmanship. After all, today marks the beginning of the end of this war." And with that she rocketed forward towards the ship that was steadily pulling ahead of the rest of the fleet. "I won't lose to you, being X. Not to your manipulations, or this puppet avatar you've placed in my path. I swear it," she promised to herself as she rocketed through a sky filled with black snow. Chapter 42. The first of the huge siege fireballs crashed into the great gates guarding the city with a heavy crack, sending cascades of snow and fractured ice spilling over the people nearby. Immediately a team of waterbenders rushed over to repair the breach, but before they could finish a second fireball collided with a bridge, melting it in an instant. It was clear to Aang that they couldn't let the bombardment continue, otherwise there'd be nothing left of the city to save. In a flash he was on Appa's back and flying towards the approaching ship. When the next great fireball was launched, Aang blocked its path, readying his staff and building a current of air in his wake. As soon as it was close enough for him to feel its heat on his skin, Aang swung forwards, batting the fireball aside with his air bending and sending it hurtling harmlessly into a nearby cliff. "I'll take it from here, boy," he called to Appa as he leapt from the bison's back and unfurled his glider, soaring down like a diving bird towards the deck of the ship. The moment his feet touched its metal surface, he summoned great waves of wind to sweep the nearby soldiers off their feet. Now, how to disable the trebuchets? They were big and sturdy-looking machines, but he'd bet that if he could find a couple of weak points. The familiar tingling of air rapidly heating sent his instincts screaming at him to move, and Aang threw himself to the side a fraction of a second before a great stream of fire roared through the space he'd just been standing in. As he hit the floor he rolled with his momentum, springing up back onto his feet and crouching into a low stance. Were all airbenders this hard to hit, or does being the Avatar give you some kind of hyper-awareness? I swear I'd have an easier time trying to hit a fly with an arrow than landing a solid strike on you. Aang clenched his jaw at the sound of the memorable voice. Standing proudly at the other end of the deck, one hand still smoking from the fire blast she'd just launched, was the golden-haired girl who seemed to be becoming more of a threat every time they crossed paths. Tanya. Tanya smirked at the sound of her name, and it struck Aang at that moment that she held herself a little differently. During their previous encounters Tanya had been very formal, always stood at attention like a perfect soldier, and rarely let her expression slip into anything besides calm confidence. Yet now she seemed a little more relaxed, and her confident gaze held a hint of cockiness to it. Perhaps she didn't feel the need to stand on ceremony without Zhao around? The other soldiers parted around her, forming a large, silent circle around the edges of the deck. "You told me once that you thought war was a senseless waste of human lives," Aang began, resolute eyes meeting her piercing gaze. "Then help me to prevent lives from being wasted now. It's not too late to stop this battle." "You know, you're absolutely right, Avatar," Tanya agreed smugly, slowly striding towards him. "There's no reason for blood to be spilled today. Let's allow cool heads to prevail and try to settle this diplomatically." Aang relaxed his stance a little, seeing the opportunity he'd been hoping for, when a memory of Zhang Jiang's guilt-hidden expression crossed his face. Immediately he tensed again, and his eyes narrowed in suspicion. He could not afford to let his guard down around Zhang Jiang's murderer. "Do you mean that?" "But of course," Tani replied jovially, coming to a stop just a few feet away from him. "Tell the Northern Water Tribe that our demands are simple: put down your weapons, relinquish Agnikal A, and surrender the Avatar to our custody. Do that, and not a single person shall be harmed. The Northern tribes will be seamlessly absorbed into the Fire Nation, and all shall be guaranteed full rights as colonial citizens." Aang glared back at her. "That's not going to happen." "No." Tanya feigned a look of hurt. "That was a rather blunt response, Avatar. You really need to work on your negotiation skills. This isn't a game, Tanya." "Good, because I'm not joking." All traces of mirth vanished from Tanya's face, leaving a deadly serious scowl in its place. "We have superior numbers, superior technology, superior tactics. Face the facts, Avatar, you are completely outclassed. The Fire Nation will win this battle. Resisting will only delay the inevitable and bring pointless suffering." "It's not inevitable. None of this is," Aang shouted back, anger welling up from within him. "The rest of the world doesn't want this war. They only want to protect themselves when the Fire Nation comes to bully them into submission. All it would take to bring this to an end is for you to convince this fleet to turn around and go home." Tanya sneered at him. "You are a child trying to find a simple solution to a problem that is so much bigger than you are. This war does not persist just because the Fire Lord wants it to. It is a messy, complicated mixture of grudges, greed and misplaced pride in all nations, that has been growing even before the death of Avatar Roku." Tanya looked away and began to pace back and forth. There can never be peace until the noblemen who profit from dealing in death can no longer fill their pockets with blood money. Until the grieving families of those who died for their countries can move past their craving for revenge. Until one side is so thoroughly beaten into the dirt that they have no choice but to accept responsibility for the war, and bear the everlasting shame of its horrors upon their shoulders. The only way to achieve peace now is for one side to emerge victorious, the quicker and more efficiently, the better. Aang shook his head. You're wrong. I'm not saying it will be easy, but the nations can resolve their differences without fighting. They just need to be willing to listen to each other again. Tanya scoffed, looking at him with thinly veiled contempt. The last time we talked, I believed that perhaps you and I were of a similar mind. I see now that I was wrong. We may both desire peace, but your methods for achieving it are rooted in foolish idealism. Mine follow the path of logic. Is that what you told yourself when you murdered Master Zhang Zhang? Aang shot back tersely, his jaw setting as anger began to well up within. That it was the logical thing to do. The smirk returned to Tanya's face, though this time it seemed more sarcastic than genuine, as if it were a deliberate attempt to rile him up. Aang hated that it was working. No. I don't take any pride in K*ling, but I can't deny that slaying that old bastard brought me some level of satisfaction. Aang's hands clenched around his glider staff. You're right. We aren't of a similar mind at all. Tanya stopped her pacing. Oh, don't go trying to play the sanctimonious card. Yes, I K*LLED Admiral Zhang, but you're just as bad. After all. Her eyes narrowed on him, like a cat preparing to pounce on a mouse. The edges of her mouth curled up in a humorless smile. You K*LLED Admiral Zhao. Angry muttering and disgusted jeers broke out from the crew surrounding them, and Aang looked around at them with wide, panicked eyes. What? No, I didn't K*LL him. I haven't K*LLED anyone. He denied desperately. Save your breath, Avatar. I was the leader of the group that found him after your little one-on-one duel. Tanya fired back. He was laying on the banks of the river, watching our burning boats crumble and break, with a great hole seared through his back. We know Zhang Zhang was teaching you to firebend, and Zhao confirmed it as he cursed your name. Tanya pressed a clenched fist against her armored chest, bowing her head in respect of a memory. It was with his dying breath that he passed on to me the secret to conquering the north. That's why I took on the mantle of admiral in his stead, and why I refused to fail. I will see the north brought to heel in his name. Cheers erupted from the soldiers, and as Aang looked around at the spite reflected in their eyes he realized that they truly believed it. People really thought he was a murderer. The injustice of it all sparked a painful, acrid heat in his chest, like bile was building up in his lungs. The airbenders had believed that it was never justified to take a life, and to be falsely accused of such an act was genuinely upsetting, even when it came from an enemy. I didn't do it. He stuttered out. I said save your breath, Avatar. There's no denying the evidence. Tanya retorted, widening her feet and stepping into a fire-bending stance. Now enough talk. Diplomacy has failed, so let's find out how good of a soldier you really are. She punctuated her point by unleashing a quick, straightforward blast of fire directly at his chest, which Aang spun out of the way from. Two more blasts quickly followed, but like a leaf in the wind Aang slipped between them with almost casual ease. Tanya readied a third blast, and it was just as Aang changed his footwork to avoid it that he heard a grunt of exertion behind him. He bent at the waist just in the nick of time to avoid the fireball that whizzed over his head, fired by the soldier directly behind him. You didn't expect this to be a fair fight, did you? Tanya chuckled, snapping her fingers. Other soldiers began launching fireballs as well, forcing Aang to leap and spin like a ballet dancer in order to keep evading them. Chapter 43. He bent at the waist just in the nick of time to avoid the fireball that whizzed over his head, fired by the soldier directly behind him. You didn't expect this to be a fair fight, did you? Tanya chuckled, snapping her fingers. Other soldiers began launching fireballs as well, forcing Aang to leap and spin like a ballet dancer in order to keep evading them. He swerved, spun, and weaved as fireball after fireball sped towards him from every side, forcing him into a relentless pace of dodging and weaving. Or at least it felt relentless at first, until after about a minute of continuous evasion Aang began sensing a rhythm to the attacks. As soon as he dodged one attack, another soldier behind him would launch a fireball of equal speed and intensity at him, an attack powerful enough to hurt, but slow enough for the soldiers on the other side of the encirclement to avoid getting hit by after he'd evaded them. The only one who wasn't attacking anymore was Tanya, who instead opted to simply watch with a look of intense concentration. She planned this. Aang realized with a start. They weren't seriously trying to defeat him. They wanted to keep him pinned down, and make him use up all his energy on evading so that he'd be too tired to combat the rest of the invasion force. He needed to get out of here. As he backflipped over the next fireball Aang looked around, his eyes landing on one of the surrounding soldiers, a big man with a prideful sneer on his face. The next time it was that soldier's turn to attack, Aang not only ducked under it, but made sure to point his posterior directly at the soldier and wiggle it at him mockingly. "Nah, you can't hit me," he taunted childishly. The big soldier's sneer dropped, and was quickly replaced by a furious scowl. He hurled another fireball, which Aang gracefully sidestepped. "Officer!" Tanya muttered warningly. "Guess I shouldn't be worried after all." Aang chimed in. "If everyone in the Fire Nation aims as poorly as him, this fleet will have set itself on fire before it reaches the city wall." The big soldier snarled like a beast and threw yet another fireball, this one notably bigger and more forceful than the last. But again Aang simply slid aside with mocking ease, smirking cheekily at him. "Stay in formation, officer!" Tanya snapped. The veins on the big soldier's temples were a prominent, swollen red, and the way he was grinding his teeth was all the indication Aang needed that he was one step away from going berserk. Zhao was far from the only Fire Nation soldier with temper issues. It seemed that, in their haste to churn out combat-ready firebenders for the front lines, their military was failing to teach new recruits how to control the aggression they were fostering within them. All it would take was one more push. As another fireball shot towards him, Aang swung his staff like a cricket bat, conjuring a gust of wind that swept the fireball off trajectory. It weakened the fire to little better than a candle flame, but it was still enough to bop the large soldier right on the nose. The soldier's eye twitched, and with an animalistic roar he went berserk. "No!" Tanya screeched, but it was too late. Two meaty hands swept down, conjuring a wave of fire that roared towards Aang. Aang simply jumped, a current of air enhancing his leap so that he sailed clear over the attack. The soldiers on the other side of the encirclement, however, weren't so skilled. The fire wave careered towards two of them, showing no signs of stopping. Their courage broke, and the soldiers dived out of the way to let the reckless attack sail past them and off the side of the ship. The encirclement was broken, and Aang wasted no time zipping forward with wind-enhanced speed through to freedom. "Idiots!" Tanya scowled, fire blasting from her feet to carry her into the sky. At the same time Aang unfurled his glider and took off. The two raced to gain height, Aang skillfully flowing with the fickle changes in air currents, while Tanya forcefully rocketed up along her own path. Before long thin layers of low-hanging clouds began to wreathe the two of them, and on an unspoken agreement the two of them ceased their ascent and began to circle one another. "Give it up, Tanya!" Aang shouted, his voice struggling to carry against the harsh whines. "The northern water tribes will never fall to you." Tanya only grinned wolfishly back at him. "That's what people said about the southern water tribes too. Ask your companions how well that worked out for them. Or better yet, look down." Despite the danger Tanya presented, Aang allowed his eyes to flicker down to see what she meant. They widened with horror at the sight below. Hundreds of Fire Nation ships sailed in formation towards the North Pole. Their numbers dirted the rich blue glow of the ocean with stains of iron black, and the smog pouring from their chimneys left a tangible black haze. Even if he could take out a ship every hour, it would take days to get rid of them all. There were simply too many for him to take down alone. "Do you see what I mean? This war is so much bigger than you!" Tanya shouted. "Even you, with all your power, cannot stop the Fire Nation. Nobody can. Set down your weapons, cease this petty resistance, and embrace the dawning of a new era." Aang did not reply, but a deep growl from behind did. Tanya swerved out of the way just in time as Appa came hurtling past towards his master, scooping the young nomad onto his back and rushing away back to Agnikal. Aang looked back to see if Tanya would pursue him, and was surprised to find that she wasn't. The golden-haired girl was just watching him go with a hostile glare. It wouldn't have mattered if she had. Even if they didn't succeed, the Fire Nation fleet was going to wreck the city. Aang could not see a way to keep them at bay when there were just too many of them. Before this siege ended, people would be dead. And he was powerless to stop it. Even when darkness had fallen, the bombardment continued. The night was nearly deathly silent. In Agnikal, the citizens cowered in their homes, while the soldiers waited in grim patience for the first sign of movement from the enemy fleet. Out at the ocean, the huge iron ships bobbed lazily up and down in the waves, quiet as graveyards, save that every minute one of them would launch a blazing coal ball at the city walls. Some would have said that such a lackluster salvo was a waste of time. Whatever the coal balls hit, it was but the work of a few hand motions from the water tribe guards to reforge again from fresh ice. However, Tanya vehemently disagreed. One of the most important factors in any form of warfare was the morale of the troops, and nothing affected that more than exhaustion. Her ships only had to spare half a dozen troops each to load and fire the trebuchets, while the rest of the crew could get a full night's sleep before the big push tomorrow morning. Meanwhile the Water Tribe didn't share that luxury. They had to keep a much larger force of soldiers awake and spread out across key points around the city on the off chance that area was targeted for bombardment. As easy as it was for them to repair their own fortifications, that didn't mean they could afford to ignore any damage, else they'd risk allowing them to become larger gaps in their defenses by the time morning came. Plus, who could sleep easily when you feared that a giant fireball might crash through the ceiling of your barracks at any minute? By the time morning came, the Fire Nation were well rested and refreshed, while the Water Tribe were cranky and impatient. It was literally when the first hint of the sun peeked out from over the horizon that the Fire Nation fleet suddenly burst into action. All at once every siege engine they had burst to life, raining an endless stream of coal balls directly at the front gates, while boarding ships began to swarm out towards the coast. The sudden shift in intensity caught the groggy waterbenders by surprise, and the guards at the main gates fell back as the unrelenting onslaught of siege fire smashed a hole in their gates and buried everything around it in piles of blazing coal. Rather than fight to hold an already comprised position, the Water Tribe followed its preferred tactic, retreating from the front walls, and falling back to the next set of defensive points. Behind the gates lay a long, flat courtyard of sheet ice broken into 4 strips by thin waterways, and at their end the inner walls that protected the actual city. The Fire Nation would have no cover along the courtyard to protect them from the ranged troops stationed on the inner wall, and it was a simple matter to sink any tanks or other mobile siege weapons into the ground. Chapter 44. Previous invasions had broken down the outer gates before, but it was on this courtyard that they'd all been held at bay from the actual city until the moon rose. With the outer gates now cleared, the boarding vessels began to dock, and a swarm of red and black armor soldiers began to spill out of the broken gates and spread along the abandoned wall, claiming what might well be their one and only staging point as they assembled into battle formations. The Water Tribe had all the time they needed to settle into their new positions before the Fire Nation advanced. The armored tanks being rolled out to the vanguard was no surprise. Using heavy machinery to spearhead their attacks was a common tactic in the Fire Nation playbook. What was somewhat more unusual was the speed of their advance. Long lines of metal carriages were hooked onto the back of the tanks, slowing them down to a sluggish plod. Along their sides, thin lines of Fire Nation troops spread out with rows of Pavis shields formed a shield wall that marched steadily forward. The slow, defensive movements better resembled the strategies employed by the Earth Kingdom, and it would have been a lie to say that it was effective. The moment they'd stepped into the perfect range, a barrage of ice and arrows hailed down upon them with such intensity that it was impossible for the inexperienced firebenders to push forward so much as a step. The slow-moving tanks were sitting ducks for gigantic snowballs that simply buried them and their crew with a single hit, and without them to lead the charge, the Fire Nation army were sitting ducks in an unrelenting blizzard of icicle fire. Watching from atop the inner walls of Agnikal, Chief Arnook frowned. "I don't understand," he muttered to Master Paku. "I've never seen the Fire Nation employ such a strategy before. And so clumsily at that. Do they think that they can weather our attacks until we're exhausted? It's not like we're going to run out of water around here. It is unusual." Paku agreed. "They are clearly not used to such tactics, and I can think of no logical reason why they'd believe such a strategy would enable them to defeat us. Their casualties are piling up, while we have barely lost a single warrior." Arnook frowned. "What do you make of the Avatar's report? That Admiral Tanya leads their forces. Her reputation claims she has ruthless cunning, but I see no sign of it here." "Indeed, but then again she's only led smaller forces in the past. Perhaps she didn't realize the difference in logistics needed to command a larger army? It would explain their sloppy coordination." Sloppy indeed. While the walls of Pavis shields prevented their troops from being outright decimated, they were barely wide enough to provide cover for more than a single soldier. Whenever the troops behind them tried to move along their battle lines in any sizable number, they were forced to break out of cover, and immediately took an icicle to the face for their trouble. They were only a few minutes into the attack, and already piles of corpses were beginning to pile up with alarming speed among the Fire Nation ranks. Chief Arnook's frown thickened. "Is it really incompetence? The Fire Nation has never hesitated to use dishonorable tactics before. Could they be feigning weakness in order to lure us into a trap?" Master Paku stroked his beard. "Perhaps, but what trap could be worth sacrificing so many soldiers for? If they keep going at this rate, they'll all be dead before moonrise." That was true. Though the Devil of the South Sea was infamous for her disregard for human life, surely even she couldn't be so heartless as to sacrifice the entirety of her own army for victory. Then why did his instincts scream that something wasn't right about this? Far away from the noise of the front lines, a colony of turtle seals lazed around their cave. It was still too early in the morning for all but the young pups to be up and about, and so the ice cavern was quiet, save for the snorting of heavy breathing and a couple of playful yaps. Suddenly a frenzy of noise burst from one of the ice holes, gasping for air and splashing around so loudly that the nearby seals jumped awake and fled. The figure that had burst from the freezing cold water ignored their alarmed barking as he pulled himself out, shivering violently, and huddled into a ball. Rhythmic pulses of orange light flashed about the cave as the figure exhaled snorts of fire to warm himself up over and over again, until the violent shivering began to fade to a manageable level. Uncle, Zuko decided, really did give him the best advice sometimes. He didn't know how his uncle had known that a simple fire-breathing technique would be so useful in such a cold climate, but he was suddenly glad he'd spent so much time under his uncle's tuition practicing his breathing. Once the shivers had stopped entirely, Zuko pushed himself up to his feet and staggered over to the mouth of the cave. The sun had risen, and Zuko greedily lapped up the warmth of its rays after his punishing experience. When Tanya had tasked him with sneaking into Agnicolae, he didn't think she'd had such a risky method in mind, but it had worked out in the end. He was far behind enemy lines, and the water tribe's full attention was turned away from him as they focused on the invading armada. He couldn't ask for better conditions for sneaking around. From what he could see, he was somewhere towards the back of the city. Recalling the map of the city Tanya had drilled into his head, that meant he couldn't be more than an hour or so away from the destination. Tanya had been very clear about how important the timing was for her strategy. Tonight would be a full moon, the zenith of the waterbender's powers, and he had to complete his mission at just the right moment. It's so warm here. How is that possible? Aang was curious about that himself. It was warm here, a pleasant bubble of tropical heat amidst the cold tundra that seemed to defy the laws of nature. Yet there was more to it than that. Something about this place felt strong and calming, like going to sleep curled up against Appa. It almost felt like this place was alive. Yue smiled proudly. It's the center of all spiritual energy in our land. She replied, leading them over to a perfectly round pond. After being chased away by Tanya, a disheartened Aang had returned to inform Chief Arnook who the leader of the Fire Nation forces really was, and how badly they were outnumbered. The chief had reassured him that, even against such numbers, Agnicolae would repel the invasion, but there was a tightness around his eyes that couldn't be disguised. Unsaid was that many soldiers on both sides would die before that happened. Lives that could have been spared if a peaceful resolution had been found. When Yue had suggested consulting the spirits for help, Aang had nearly kicked himself for not thinking of it himself. Of course. If anyone could help the Northern Water Tribe, it was the spirits. They could do anything. And even better, Yue thought that this pool they stood before now could be the gateway he needed to cross over into the spirit world. Following his instincts, Aang walked over to the edge of the pool and sat cross-legged in front of it, assuming the meditative pose Gyatso had taught him. His eyes settled upon two fish within the pond, one black, one white, swimming in circles around each other. As he watched them, Aang felt something starting to pull at him from within. The steady spiraling of the fish was hypnotic, pulling him further and further towards the water. Blue light began to glow from Aang's eyes and tattoos as his body went still, and the spirit of the Avatar crossed between worlds. Chapter 45. The sun hung directly in the middle of the sky, signaling that it was midday, and yet in the hours that had passed since the start of their attack the Fire Nation had barely made it halfway along the courtyard. The only reason the Fire Nation had been able to move forward at all under the barrage of ice being thrown at them was because their dead had stacked up in such numbers that they formed makeshift barriers, providing enough cover for reinforcements to be sent to the front. Not that they did much good, as the fresh influx of troops only allowed the front lines to push forward another dozen or so feet before being forced to halt under the pressure of the incoming attacks. 6 hours and thousands of lives had bought Tanya about enough ground to build a row of houses on. The amount of red and black armored corpses littering the ground was frankly ridiculous, yet still more kept popping their heads up from behind the shield wall each second. Even with so many ships, Tanya must have been packing her soldiers in like sardines to fit so many. It says something about the discipline used by the Fire Nation military that after a morning spent watching their comrades' lives being thrown away, their soldiers still aren't showing any signs of deserting. Master Pakku mused grimly. They're like docile cattle allowing themselves to be led to the slaughterhouse. Indeed. That's what unnerves me about this whole invasion. Chief Arnook replied. It's like they all don't care if they die. Pakku let out a heavy sigh. In all my years I have never seen a sight like this. We should be celebrating, we must be taking close to 100 lives of their lives for every one that we lose. I don't believe there's ever been a battle that has been so decisively in our favor before. Something about it feels unnerving. I agree. But in the end it matters little. Arnook countered. Begin assembling the warriors behind the gates. If they're happy to sit their bleeding troops in front of us, then so be it. The moment the moon rises we'll sweep what remains of them away in one big push, and that will be the end of it. With the civilians staying sheltered at home and the soldiers focusing their attention on the invading army, Zuko found sneaking through the streets of Agnikul no challenge at all. Despite how often he'd been told growing up that a prince did not skulk around in the shadows like a common thief, Zuko couldn't deny that it felt somewhat liberating whenever he got to put his stealth skills to use. It was one of the few things he could honestly say that he was as talented as Azula at it. Figures that the only thing I can do right is something that father disapproves of. His white winter gear blended in perfectly as he darted amidst buildings made of packed snow, crouching in the shadows whenever a patrol came close. He made swift, steady progress navigating his way through the back streets and alleys, until eventually he found himself standing outside his destination. He pressed his fingers against the ice wall, melting handholds he could use to pull himself up, then repeated the process to steadily scramble his way up. The moment he was over the wall, Zuko could feel a change in the very atmosphere. It was pleasantly warm here, not in a dry or humid sense, but like the pools of water that formed on top of the geysers in the volcanic regions of the Fire Nation. Yet even that description felt like it was missing something. There was a palpable energy to this place, an almost magical spark to the air that called to mind the stories Uncle had told him about the spirit world. Zuko stalked forward, silently crossing the small field of grass towards a bridge that led deeper into the sanctuary. He could hear voices up ahead, but they didn't have the deep timbre of fully grown adults that guards would have had. As he drew close enough to make them out more clearly, one of the voices caught his attention, and his face hardened into a dark scowl. He knew that voice. For the love of the spirits, please let it not be them. But of course, like always, the spirits were not with him. Two girls stood at the heart of the sanctuary, one with white hair that he didn't recognize, and one with black hair that he did. It was the Southern Water Tribe peasant who trailed after the Avatar, and who he had to grudgingly admit had helped the last airbender outfox him a couple of times now. Katara. And if she was here? Every muscle in Zuko's body tensed, like a bloodhound spotting a rabbit, as his eyes settled upon his destined prey. Sitting cross-legged beside the pool was the Avatar, eyes and tattoos glowing, but body relaxed as if asleep. Typical. Just typical. He'd spent years of sleepless nights trying to find the Avatar, and the one time that he would have actually liked to avoid him for just a few minutes, the universe dropped him right in front of him. His eyes flickered to the sky. The sun was beginning its final descent, bathing the world in an orange glow as it prepared to dip beneath the horizon. His time was drawing inevitably closer. There was no time left for hesitation. Fists clenched, he strode out across the bridge, ready for a fight. The moment the sun touched the horizon and the moon began to rise in its place, the warriors of the north could feel the tides of spiritual power around them changing. Strength welled up inside them, the light of the full moon charging them with celestial might. With it came an itch to use that power, to smite the invaders who dared trespass upon their homes. A collective shudder rippled across the army assembled behind the gates of Agnikul as each and every waterbender felt the strength of two men flow through their veins. Now they were invincible. On a night like this they could slay dragons, split oceans, and challenge the very spirits themselves. So then why couldn't he shake this feeling of doom? Pakku was not a young man. The great wealth of age was the wisdom born from experience, and he was among the wisest men in the world. Yet one lesson he'd never fully learned was when to trust his head, and when to follow his gut. His head told him that this was the moment of victory. The Fire Nation had been foolish, so assured in their own superiority that they'd attacked during the zenith of their enemy's strength. Every history book ever written supported the theory that on the night of a full moon the water tribes could never lose. The very laws of nature favored them at this moment. Yet his gut counseled him otherwise. Life was hard and unforgiving, and it was often the solutions that seemed the easiest that reaped the heaviest toll. Even the most optimistic warrior could not have hoped this invasion would have gone so well for the water tribes, and yet it had. The Fire Nation had brought an army nearly 5 times their size and yet had failed to even touch their city. At this rate the siege of the north would be known as the greatest military blunder in history, despite being devised by the most ruthless strategic mind the Fire Nation had this generation. Master Pakku, the full moon has risen. A warrior standing beside him stated. Idiot. He was old, not blind. Shouldn't we attack? Logically speaking, yes, they should. Yet Paku found his gut just wouldn't let him. He couldn't quite put his finger on why exactly, but neither could he dismiss the lingering specter of doom that prevented him from giving the order. What harm was there in staying safe and secure behind their fortifications after all? At the rate they were going, the Fire Nation was bound to run out of troops any minute now and would be forced to surrender. No, we won't. He sighed, waving a hand dismissively. Send the warriors back to their posts. We can. It's her. The devil. It was one of the lookouts who'd cried out, and all eyes snapped in the direction of his outstretched arm to see the light that was rising up above the outer gate like a malevolent star. Despite her short stature and the distance between them, her golden hair stood out like a torch among shadows. The devil of the South Sea was looking down on them. Paku was an old man. His blood no longer ran hot and fierce as it did with the youths of this generation. Yet that did not make him immune to the call of anger. A temper as cold as the fiercest blizzard broiled within his stomach, clouding out the warnings of his instincts in a haze of red mist. The girl who has slain one of his oldest and dearest friends waited beyond the wall, sneering down upon him and the people that he had dedicated his life to protecting. She had murdered Zhang Zhang, and now sacrificed her own countrymen in her own vain quest for glory. Open the gates! He barked, his eyes narrowing like a hawk focusing upon its prey. Behind him the warriors of the north snarled, hands gripping tightly around spears as they embraced the vigor of the moon. Forget instincts. Forget caution. A devil stood at the precipice of their city, and there was only one wise thing to do when you met a devil. Slaughter it. With a heavy thud the icy gates of Agnicolae opened, and the warriors of the north roared forwards like a flood released from a dam. They had suffered the indignity of the Fire Nation trespassing upon their homeland while the sun shined, but with the rising of the moon it was time for the tide to rush back and sweep the filth away from their shores. The mere sight of their frenzied charge shattered the Fire Nation's morale, and with panicked cries their soldiers turned tail and fled back to the safety of their ships. Yet the sight of fleeing prey only egged the Water Tribe warriors on even more. They swept across the icy courtyards, racing across the piles of fallen Fire Nation soldiers as they chased down their quarry. Not for a moment did Paku's eyes leave the golden-haired demon that hovered in the distance, even as the ice and water beneath his feet twisted and churned at his passing. That brat deserved everything coming to her and more. What hubris she had, to think that after everything she'd done, all the pain she'd caused, she could so casually show her face before them. It was almost like she was provoking us? Chapter 46. That brat deserved everything coming to her and more. What hubris she had, to think that after everything she'd done, all the pain she'd caused, she could so casually show her face before them. It was almost like she was provoking us? The errant thought cut through the red mist that had clouded Paku's vision like a butcher's knife, stopping him dead in his tracks even as the unstoppable tide of warriors at his back parted around him. Why would she attack on the night of a full moon? Why would she so stubbornly stick to a defensive tactic even as her soldiers bled out in front of her? Why would she present herself like bait right at the moment her army was at its weakest? The only way it made sense was if she'd wanted them to attack her. If she'd wanted them to abandon their own walls for a decisive charge. The smell of decay wafted into Paku's nose, setting off alarm bells within his mind. He'd become familiar with the scent of rotting corpses, an unfortunate cost to a youth spent fighting on the battlefield, yet now that he stopped to think about it he'd never smelled it so keenly on the first day of a battle. The masked body of a fallen Fire Nation soldier lay lifelessly at his feet, and in a moment of introspection Paku knelt down and carefully removed its helmet. The face that stared back at him was pale and sallow, its skin gaunt and clinging tightly to the bone. Sunken eyes stared in an empty daze up at the sky. Yet what caught Paku's attention was the blow that had taken this poor soul's life, a large, bloody gash across the neck. A gash that was flecked with shards of rock. This man didn't die today. Paku whispered to himself, the revelation dawning in his mind as fragments of Tanya's confusing puzzle started coming together into one clear picture. This soldier must have died weeks ago, fighting against earthbenders somewhere in the contested regions of the Earth Kingdom. The elderly waterbender looked out across the courtyard littered with dead Fire Nation soldiers that the warriors of his tribe stepped over without a second glance. What if all these fallen soldiers were the same? What if Tanya had packed the cargo holds of her ships full to burst with casualties stolen from battlefields across the Earth Kingdom, only to place them outside her Agnicolae as a decoy? If that was the case, then where was her real army? Stop! It's a trap! He cried desperately, but his voice was drowned out amidst the frenzied howls of his moonlight-drunk kinsmen. They were so assured of their invincibility beneath the night sky that all care for caution and strategy had completely departed them. They were like a pack of wolves, howling to the silver moon as they prepared to sink their fangs into their enemies. Yet the howling cut off abruptly, and their berserk charge ground to a sudden halt as the silver rays of the moon bled into a deep, bloody red. She's found herself a master. Zuko had approximately half a second for that thought to process before a torrent of water slapped him directly in the face, throwing him back as if a Komodo rhino had run straight into him. Who knew that water could pack such a wallop? The fight had been going so well at the beginning. He'd been fast and fierce, a relentless torrent of flames that had forced the water peasant onto the defensive. Yet the lower the sun dipped the weaker he became, whereas the peasant's strength grew with the rising moon. Slowly but inevitably her defenses became more assured, and the counter-attacks she was throwing came in faster and more regularly, until Zuko realized he was the one on the defensive. The longer this went on, the smaller his chance of victory would become. And he only had a few seconds left before the window of opportunity for his part of the plan closed. He had to finish this, and fast. Two waves writhed along the ground towards him, and Zuko waited until they had almost reached him before pushing himself up and to the side with both arms and legs, vaulting himself to the side and evading them by a hair's breadth. He snapped out a kick, unleashing a quick bolt of fire that forced Katara to reshape her follow-up attack into a shield to guard against. With the moment's breathing room he had, Zuko squared his feet and deepened his stance, punching forward to unleash an unending stream of flames. More water flowed to Katara to maintain her shield, and a serpentine hiss filled the air as fire met water. Zuko settled deeper into his stance, redoubling the strength of his flames in an effort to power through Katara's barrier. But there was no overpowering her under a full moon. It would be foolish to waste any more energy trying. As the torrent of fire ceased, Katara's form shifted, preparing to turn her barrier into a sweeping wave that would knock Zuko back to the ground. It was thrilling to finally be able to put her training to good use. In the past Zuko had been a fearsome threat, an unstable firebender that she had no choice to run from if she didn't want to get burned. But now she could fight back. Now she could finally repay all the fear he'd caused her and her brother. Her wave lashed out, whipping through the cloud of steam kicked up from Zuko's previous attack. Yet there was no satisfying crack of water slapping flesh. The wave passed through empty air. Katara had no chance to finish her sentence as a figure burst out of the steam to her left. Zuko dropped low and slid tackled her, swiping her feet out from under her before she could change stances again. Katara hit the floor hard, her head hitting the ground with a loud thud, while Zuko executed the same spin he'd used in his duel against Zhao to quickly flip back onto his feet. The smack to the head must have concussed Katara, who seemed to be fighting to stay awake. It was almost impressive how she refused to succumb to the urge while her friend was in danger. Dismissing her, Zuko turned away and strode towards the pool. A weak slosh of water splashed his back. "I won't let you take Aang," Katara gasped, hunched over and with wobbling knees. She'd pushed herself to her feet through sheer force of will. Zuko ignored her and resumed his walk to the pool. The Avatar sat silent and unmoving by the poolside, taunting him with how easy he'd be to capture in this state. All he had to do was reach out his hand and grab him. "Why is it that you, Zhao, and I have been unable to capture the Avatar?" Zuko scowled, a reflex action by now whenever someone brought up his failures. "He keeps getting lucky." "Wrong," Tanya replied, pacing back and forth around the command tent. "You blame luck because the truth embarrasses you. The Avatar has not evaded capture for this long on luck alone. Nor is it because he has relied on his Avatar powers, barring a few exceptional cases. No, it is because he is more skilled than us." "What?" Zuko shouted, shooting to his feet with a scornful glare. "That's ridiculous. I have trained for years to defeat the Avatar." "Exactly." Tanya cut him off, stepping forward into his comfort zone suddenly enough to make Zuko flinch back. "You have been training to defeat the Avatar. Everyone expected that, once the Avatar returned, the only way to capture him would be through some epic duel. That he would want to fight us, as his predecessors have." She shook her head. "But that was a miscalculation. We overlooked that this Avatar was raised as an air nomad, a strictly pacifist culture. His entire style of bending is designed not for fighting, but for escaping. And he's probably been trained in that style even since he could walk. You, me, Zhao and every other firebender has been trained how to fight our enemies, but he's not fighting us, he's just been blowing us back long enough to run away. It's like telling a professional wrestler to try and catch a professional sprinter. We can't catch him because he refuses to let himself be drawn into a proper fight. Every confrontation with him turns into a glorified game of tag, and he's specialized in that more than we are. Zuko looked at her with bewilderment. Then you're saying it's impossible to ever catch him? Not impossible, no. We just have to stop playing his games, and start playing ours. Tanya stepped back, a caddish smile growing on her lips. You know, as much as you beat yourself up for not catching the Avatar, you forget that you have actually succeeded once already, albeit not for long. Remember what you told me about your first encounter with him at the South Pole? Zuko nodded. Yes. I had him captive on my ship. And how did you manage that? By fighting him? No. He surrendered to me willingly in order to spare a village. Precisely. Tanya hissed, eyes alighting wickedly. You succeeded back then because you didn't try to chase him down, you forced him to come to you. If your ship had been better equipped to contain a rampaging Avatar, we would have won by now. And as it so happens, I have a whole fleet at my disposal, and more than enough resources to keep an Avatar locked up for good this time. Zuko looked down at the map of Aang with a frown. But that only worked last time because I threatened the village. You're already planning to besiege the North Pole anyway. What could we use as bait? We just need something that he places above his own well-being. Something he feels is worth sacrificing his own freedom for. His companions? I've tried that before. Tanya chuckled. Shrewd thinking, but no. I'm talking about something bigger than personal attachment. Something grand. Something that appeals to his unshakable duty as the Avatar. Chapter 47. His companions? I've tried that before. Tanya chuckled. Shrewd thinking, but no. I'm talking about something bigger than personal attachment. Something grand. Something that appeals to his unshakable duty as the Avatar. Zuko's hands speared through the water, snapping up the two targets with the speed and precision of a diving bird. They wriggled and thrashed wildly into his hands as he pulled them out into the warm night air, but Zuko refused to relinquish his grip. Instead, each one was stuffed unceremoniously into a waterproof bag, which Zuko then drew tight and dipped into the pond long enough to fill with water. The spirit of the moon struggled against the bag, trying to push through the leathery material to reach its eternal partner, the spirit of the ocean, that it could feel mere inches away. Yet they were part of the mortal world now, and their bodies did not have the strength for the task. The eternal push and pull that the two spirits had maintained for thousands of years had been broken. And up in the sky above, the moon began to bleed a crimson red. The warriors of the water tribe stood stunned, unsure what to think of the strange phenomenon up above. The moon was more than just a celestial body in the night sky. More than just the source of their powers. More than the object of their worship. It was an immutable fact of the world, a law of nature that could never be broken. Civilizations rose and fell, wars were waged and forgotten, yet through it all the moon had always been there in the sky at night, illuminating the chaos below it with its silver light. Yet tonight the moon bled. And without it the waterbenders found themselves absolutely powerless. Yet while the water tribe was paralyzed with shock, the Fire Nation was not. High up in the sky Tanya made a hand signal, and war horns bellowed out from behind the ruins of the broken gate. Cries of panic erupted out amidst the water tribe ranks as legions of fresh Fire Nation soldiers began to march out from behind the walls. Yet while those at the front of the water tribe's charge cried out in shock, those at the back cried out in terror. Armored hands burst up like flowers from the piles of Fire Nation corpses they'd ran over, clawing for purchase as the bodies attached to them pulled themselves up. Spirit-fearing warriors prayed for salvation as the Fire Nation dead rose up behind them, surrounding them on all sides. In the sky above Tanya grinned with malice, and barked a single command to her soldiers below. K*LL them all. Here we go, ladies and gentlemen. Part 1 of the Siege of the North. I'm sure a few people are going to write comments about this if I don't, so I'm going to make it clear right now that no, Tanya isn't actually raising the dead. As much as I reckon she'd make a great necromancer, I'm only going to stick to the 4 forms of bending and other canon supernatural powers. What she's done is gather an army's worth of corpses from other battlegrounds and brought them to the invasion with her, stored within the carriages attached to her tanks. Behind the cover of the shield walls her troops have been unloading these corpses and piling them up on top of the living. Thus she creates the illusion that her army is sitting there letting itself be massacred, while in reality setting up for an ambush. I'm planning to finish the Siege of the North with an equally sized Part 2 next chapter, and then tidy up the loose threads that aren't so important to this battle with an interlude chapter before we get into the Earth book. I'm busy with work as always, but hopefully part 2 will be ready in a couple of months or so. See you then. The water tribe was in shambles. To be fair, anybody else would have been just as terrified as they were in their situation, hardened warriors or not. Combat training prepared you to handle traps, ambushes, and all sorts of nasty tactical maneuvers. It did not, however, prepare you for the moon turning red, your bending being stolen away, and the dead bodies of your enemies rising back to life behind you. Through their eyes the world must have seemed as if it had turned into a living nightmare in the span of a few short seconds. Mind-numbing confusion and fear was an understandable reaction given the circumstances. That didn't mean that Tanya would hesitate to take advantage of it. K*LL them all! She shouted, her voice carrying easily over the chaos below. The bloody moon had confused her own soldiers just as much as the enemy, but those who'd been tasked with hiding beneath the piles of the dead weren't just any troops, they were the ones who'd been under her direct command for most of her military career. They'd had years to associate the sound of her voice with orders that had to be followed on pain of harsh consequences, and her sharp order was enough to snap many of them out of their bewilderment. The first volley of fire blasts crashed into the water tribe's ranks, completely unhindered by the barriers of water and ice that would have usually risen up to stop them. Within the first few seconds it was obvious that Tanya had them in checkmate. Almost the entire Northern Water Tribe army was trapped out on the open courtyard without so much as a sheet of paper to take cover behind, pincered between Fire Nation forces that outnumbered them 3-1. If they had the moon they could have fought back, they could have erected new barriers from the ice beneath their feet, reorganized themselves and pushed back through the relatively thin line of soldiers standing between them and the safety of Agnicol. But the moon was no longer with them. Their waterbenders were not only completely disarmed, but were randomly mixed around with their armed warriors after their messy, disorganized charge. They huddled back in helpless fear as the first volley of fireballs set their friends and comrades alight, their panic trapping the non-benders in a crushing mass of bodies that stopped them from forming a decent shield wall. Whatever orders their commanders tried to issue were drowned out beneath the rising cacophony of pained and fearful screams. Meanwhile the Fire Nation soldiers quickly realized that they'd just been presented with a shooting gallery. Their enemy was trapped and terrified, cowering away from their fire like mice, and unable to do more than throw the odd spear back at them in retaliation. Beneath the light of the red moon, bloodlust began to take its hold. The feverish madness that had been festering since the beginning of the invasion alighted in their eyes, a red mist that made their hands move instinctively, and their mouths stretch into ghoulish grins as they threw fireball after fireball into the quailing ranks of the pathetic waterbenders. Within the first minute so much fire was being thrown at both sides of the water tribe's army that, from her view up above, Tanya could nearly see two walls of fire squeezing the water tribe in on itself. How long would it take for her troops to burn their way through the entire water tribe army? An hour? Perhaps 2, if they managed to string together some semblance of organization. Her commanders would no doubt say that it was just a countdown to victory at this point, but Tanya wasn't willing to congratulate herself just yet. Not while there was one wild card still left up the water tribe's sleeve. Her eyes scanned the trembling mass of warriors below, searching for a speck of orange amidst the sea of blue garbs and frowning ever deeper when she failed to find it. Where was the Avatar? Even if he was too much of a pacifist to lead the charge himself, he'd expected him to be among the water tribe's ranks as they sallied forth to meet her. She'd even gone and dangled herself up in the sky like this as bait to draw him out. Yet there was no sign of large gusts of wind trying to blow apart her encirclement. Had he actually been wise enough to stay behind in reserve? If so, then he was probably hunting down Zuko right at this very moment, trying to shift the tide of the battle back in the water tribe's favor by freeing the ocean and moon spirits. Sadly there was nothing more she could do to assist Zuko. The exiled prince had played his part perfectly so far, all he had to do now was bring the captured spirits to her before the Avatar caught him. Not an easy task by any stretch of the imagination, but Zuko was as stubborn as an ox when it came to regaining his honor, and there was nobody else in the Fire Nation more familiar with the way the Avatar thought. If anyone could do it, it was him. Come to think of it, she'd better get started setting up the finale to her plan. It wasn't like the battle below needed her supervision anymore. With a satisfied smile Tanya flew towards Agnicol, not so much as sparing a glance at the massacre taking place beneath her feet. Chapter 48. With a sharp gasp of breath, Aang's eyes snapped open. Aang! Katara cried, rushing over to his side with Yue and Sokka right behind her. Are you okay? I'm fine. Aang replied, shaking off the quick bout of dizziness that came from re-entering his body. There's no time. We have to hurry. The moon spirit is in danger. Oh no. In danger. Sokka quipped sarcastically. Yeah, we guessed that. The moon up above shone with an unnatural, bloody red light. Even if he'd been blind, Aang could have sensed the feeling of pain and anguish radiating from it. What happened? He whispered. It's all my fault. Katara sobbed, leaning into Yue as the silver-haired princess hugged her. After you crossed into the spirit world, Zuko appeared. I fought him, but I let myself get overconfident and he beat me. I thought he was coming to take you away, but then he walked right past you and took the koi fish. Aang breathed. That's right. Katara sniffled, bewilderment settling across her expression. As soon as he did, the moon turned red, and all of a sudden my water bending just stopped. Aang, what's happening? Those fish aren't regular fish. Aang explained, standing up hurriedly. I met someone in the spirit world who told me that the ocean and moon spirits had to give up their immortality in order to become a part of our world, and that they took on the forms of those two koi. But they need to exist in a constant state of push and pull with each other. If Zuko has separated the two fish, then the balance between them is broken. Which means no more water bending. Sokka summarized. But what I don't get is Zuko. He's been obsessed with capturing you before, but now he gives up his best chance at you yet in exchange for the ocean and moon spirits? How did he even know about them anyway? I don't think he's acting alone this time. I think he's following orders. Aang replied. And there's one person who benefits from this more than anyone else. Without waterbenders, who's going to stop the invasion? Katara gasped as the realization dawned on her. Zuko is working for Tanya. Sokka hummed thoughtfully. If that's true, then Zuko is probably trying to bring the spirits to her. Assuming she's somewhere near the battlefield, he'll have to sneak through the city to reach her. We might still be able to catch him and free the spirits before he reaches the safety of the Fire Nation fleet. Then that's what we'll do. Aang declared, blowing his bison whistle. Appa appeared a few seconds later, and the gang wasted no time climbing onto his back. Yip. We've got spirits to save. Zuko ran through the streets of Agnikal, fear hastening his steps. But no matter where he went there was no escaping the red moonlight. It reflected off the glistening white buildings, taunting him at every turn. He hadn't realized it would be like this. To hear Tanya describe it, the waterbender's powers would have simply stopped, but otherwise everything else should have been fine. Had she known what effect their actions would have on the moon? No, she couldn't have. Right? No. Focus. Zuko mentally slapped himself. There was no time for thinking like this. He couldn't let himself get distracted while he was so close. Whatever was happening to the moon was only temporary. As soon as the Avatar turned himself in and the Northern Water Tribe surrendered, he could bring his captive fish back together again, and everything would go back to normal. He had to remember what was important, regaining his honor. He sprinted past another house, trying his best to ignore the terrified wailing of the children sheltering within. Stealth was no longer needed. Whatever soldiers had been left behind to patrol the city were either too distracted or too slow to catch him as he ran by. The only one who could stop him now was the Avatar, and so Zuko kept a wary eye up to the sky in case that lumbering white bison showed up. And show up it eventually did, just as Zuko arrived at the inner gates. It was still far away enough that he couldn't make out who exactly was on its back, but gut instincts told him that the Avatar must be there. The sky bison roared as it stopped him, and Zuko put all his energy into one final dash across the open courtyard towards the battleground. He knew how fast that beast could be in a pinch. The sounds of screams and the whooshing of fire grew loud enough to drown out the sound of his own heavy breathing as Zuko charged towards the battlefield. There, waiting for him before it, was a familiar shade of blonde hair. He was so close now. Just a little further. A bestial groan erupted from behind him, and Zuko looked back to see that the sky bison was nearly upon him. On its back, cloaked in the traditional orange garb of his people, was the Avatar, looking right at him with fierce determination. Zuko! Stop! Zuko did not stop. Instead he pushed himself to run harder. Damn it, he was so close and yet still too far. He wasn't going to make it. A jet of orange light exploded forth from in front of him, narrowly missing Zuko's head and singing his hair. Tanya had opened fire. With a panicked grunt, the sky bison swerved away to avoid being hit by the blast, allowing Zuko to make the final dash to the meeting point. Said meeting point was an unremarkable stretch of ice a dozen or so feet away from the line of firebender who'd sprung up behind the waterbenders after their charge, blocking their escape back to Agnikal. 6 firebenders had been pulled away from the slaughter to form a wide line, and 2 of the metal tanks that had been buried under snow during the initial assault had been melted free and detached from their carriages in order to be moved to the end of each point. Standing in the middle and slightly in front of the formation was Tanya, looking as calm and unflappable as ever despite the chaos taking place behind her. "You have them both?" Tanya asked as Zuko came to a stop in front of her. Zuko nodded, his panting too heavy to form coherent words, but held aloft the 2 wriggling bags. The wide, wolfish smile that never ceased to spike fear into Zuko's heart spread across Tanya's lips. "Excellent!" Another bestial cry sounded behind him, and Zuko turned to see the sky bison coming in to land a few feet behind him. The soldiers tensed into fire-bending stances, preparing to shoot at it, but paused as Tanya held up a hand in a halting gesture. Zuko twisted around and conjured a fireball in his hand, holding in warningly just a little bit below the bags that held the captured spirits as the Avatar and his companions dismounted. "Stop this!" cried the Avatar desperately, raising his staff into a fighting stance. "You don't understand what you're doing. You're putting the balance of the entire world in danger." "I am? Oh my, how careless of me!" Tanya replied sarcastically, staring back at him unfazed. "Well, it's a good thing that you're here then, isn't it? After all, protecting the balance of the world is your duty. I'm sure you'll do whatever it takes to ensure no harm befalls the ocean and moon spirits, right?" Sensing his cue, Zuko raised his held fireball just a little higher, letting the flames lick the underside of the bags warningly. "Truth be told, I'd rather not hurt the spirits unnecessarily," Tanya continued blithely. "But if you make any aggressive moves I'm afraid I'll be forced to. There are 2 of them after all, I can afford to execute one to prove that I'm serious if you test me." Her tone took on a hard edge as her eyes steeled over. "Lower your weapon, Avatar. That's an order." The Avatar grit his teeth, struggling to decide what to do, and the Fire Nation soldiers tensed as his hands gripped tighter around his staff. Then, as if the fight had suddenly spilled out of him, the Avatar lowered his staff, his body turning slumped and listless as he accepted his defeat. I surrender," he whispered, his broken tone coming out as a lifeless echo on the voice of one so young. "Aang, no!" Katara cried, but her plea went ignored. Her brother held her back, while the silver-haired girl watched on silently with eyes brimming with tears. Chapter 49. I surrender," he whispered, his broken tone coming out as a lifeless echo on the voice of one so young. "Aang, no!" Katara cried, but her plea went ignored. Her brother held her back, while the silver-haired girl watched on silently with eyes brimming with tears. Tanya smirked, her eyes flashing dangerously. "A smart decision." He gave a gesture with one hand, and 2 of the soldiers flanking her ran over to the tanks. From each one they unrolled a coil of heavy chains, spare anchor chains taken somewhere from the fleet, which had been fastened to the hooks on the back of the tanks. They approached the Avatar, clamping unnecessarily thick metal cuffs on each of his arms. It almost seemed ridiculous how much heavy metal was being used to restrain such a skinny boy, if one could forget that said boy had sunken entire battleships single-handed in the past. The tanks reversed slightly, pulling the Avatar's arms far apart enough that it would limit the majority of his bending moves. Tanya took a few steps forward until she was beside Zuko, the faintest touch of amusement in her tone. "You know, this reminds me of the first time we had a proper chance to talk. Somehow I doubt the blue spirit will come along to save you again though." For a brief moment, so quick anyone else would dismiss it as a trick of the light, Aang's eyes flickered to meet Zuko's. The banished prince felt the uncomfortable emotion that had been sitting in his stomach ever since the moon turned red begin to churn within him. But why? Shouldn't he be happy? He'd finally caught the Avatar, and in a way that he couldn't escape from this time. He'd finally got it all back, his nation, his birthright, his honor. Honor? A treacherous voice that sounded suspiciously like Uncle whispered in the back of his head. "Where is the honor in this? In anything that the Fire Nation has done today? You know, Avatar, you remind me of someone," Tanya said wistfully, looking strangely peaceful for a moment, before her expression curled up into a cold snarl. "The one woman I can honestly say I've genuinely hated on a deep, personal level. The most self-righteous, hypocritical, psychopathic zealot I've ever had the misfortune of meeting." She began pacing back and forth, seeming to lose herself somewhat in the memories. "She was a chosen one just like you. Picked by a self-proclaimed higher power for the sole purpose of being a thorn in my side." "Oh, and wasn't she just that?" Stubborn bitch just wouldn't die no matter how much I threw at her. You know I dropped an entire building on her once, and she just shrugged it off like it was a pillow fort. It was like the universe itself was wrapped around her like armor, keeping her safe where literally anyone else would have had the common courtesy to just die already. Tanya halted suddenly mid-rant, taking a deep breath to collect herself. Zuko watched with wide eyes, slightly stunned by what he'd just witnessed. He'd never seen Tanya lose her composure like that, made all the more perplexing by the fact that he had absolutely no idea who she was talking about. Was this someone she'd encountered during her raids on the Earth Kingdom? But you know, Tanya continued, despite whatever bullshit cosmic powers she'd been granted, she was still just a human in the end. Still just as prone to making stupid mistakes as the rest of us. She let her guard down, showed her weakness, and I destroyed her for it. She turned back to face Aang, all hints of emotion stored away behind a mask of cool confidence once again. And now it's your turn. Here's the situation, Avatar. Right now the Water Tribe is powerless, disorganized and trapped between my forces. As we speak, more and more of them are falling by the second. I could order my men to cease fire right now. It's clear as day that the Fire Nation is victorious tonight. But do you know what? Tanya knelt down so she was eye level with the Avatar, glaring directly into his grey eyes. I'm not going to. Zuko fidgeted nervously as the uncomfortable sensation in his gut roiled around sickeningly. This hadn't been part of the plan. Now the Avatar was in custody, all she was supposed to do was transfer him onto their most secure ship and bring the battle to an end. What was she doing? They can't fight back anymore. There's no need for this. Aang yelled frantically, his gaggle of friends echoing his thoughts with their own cries of horror. Tanya ignored them. The slaughter will stop the moment that you comply with my next order. The longer you take, the more who will die. She shot back sharply. If you want this invasion to end, there is one last thing that you must do. Her eyes narrowed, a flicker of something dark and truly menacing passing across her impassive face so quickly that none could discern what it was. Enter the Avatar state. What? Aang did not understand. The Avatar state. Was she insane? Every time he'd entered into that state before he'd lost all control of himself, and caused wide-scale destruction. He'd almost hurt Sokka and Katara back when he found Monk Gyatso's skeleton. Why would she want him to tap into that power when she'd practically won the battle already? But I can't control it. He hurriedly replied, very aware that every second he wasted meant another life lost for the Water Tribe. I can't even turn it on at will. Tanya did not seem interested in his excuses. So far you've entered the Avatar state during times of heightened emotion. When the pressure becomes too much for you to handle. Do you mean to tell me that the systematic extermination of the Water Tribe's warriors isn't emotional enough for you? Her eyes drifted up to where Katara, Sokka, and Yue were standing. Perhaps you need a more personal incentive then. No. Don't touch them. Aang shouted, hysteria beginning to take hold. And as it did, so too did the uncomfortable tickle at the back of his skull begin to flare up, the way it had before when he was close to slipping into the Avatar state. A hint of power must have flashed out his eyes, because all of a sudden Tanya had rounded on him again with the aggression of a hungry predator. Yes. That's it. Don't fight that feeling, Avatar. Realize how powerless you are, how close you are to losing the people you care about most, and let that sensation take over you. Let the real Avatar out. Aang could feel the power welling up and beginning to trickle up his spine like liquid fire. His vision was starting to grow hazy as waking nightmares, visions of the remains of the massacred air nomads, swam across eyes. It was happening again. The Fire Nation would wipe out the people of the North Pole because once again he hadn't been there for them. He'd failed his duty as the Avatar. Whatever instincts screamed at him not to listen to Tanya grew distant and muted as light began to creep into the corners of his eyes. Why not give in? Better a rampaging Avatar than a failed one. Just let the power out. No. A roar of fire, hotter and heavier than anything he'd ever felt before, cut between him and Tanya like a wall, making them both flinch back in fright. The surprise snapped Aang back to reality, clearing his head of the power insidiously creeping up from within him. It seemed that Tanya had been completely taken off guard by it as well, if the look of utter shock on her face was any indication. What? Who? Tanya's head snapped around in the direction the flames had come from, and her eyes widened in astonishment. Standing there in a fire-bending stance he'd never seen before, a black cloak billowing around red armor, was a familiar old man with an unfamiliar look of such determination that it almost seemed to glow in the light of the fire he'd conjured. Tanya seemed dumbfounded for half a second, before her expression morphed into a hateful glare. General Iroh. Chapter 50. Tanya hated it when an unexpected variable showed up. It was impossible to completely control every aspect of the battlefield. One could spend a decade writing contingency plans, yet still be caught off guard by something as simple as an outbreak of the common cold. Her time at officers' school had taught her the importance of being able to adapt your plan when something unexpected occurred, and Tanya prided herself at being rather good at that, but that didn't mean she had to like it. Iroh was one such variable, and one she had a particular distaste for. The fat old man had been given the best start in life imaginable in this world, born the prince and heir to the Fire Nation. He'd been dropped into the pinnacle of luxury without having to lift a finger. But what had he done with his opportunities? First he'd slain the last of the dragons, dooming a unique and likely majestic species to extinction purely for bragging rights. Then he laid siege to Ba Sing Se, only to give up on the eve of victory when his son was K***led in battle. How did he think that had looked to his soldiers? Thousands of troops had given their lives during that siege, yet all their sacrifice was wasted at the last moment as soon as royal blood was spilled. And to top it all off, after returning home and having his time to grieve, Iroh had never taken another job. He'd become a tea-drinking freeloader mooching off the royal palace's income, rather than using his position as the new Fire Lord's brother to assist with political duties. In summary, he was a prideful, lazy elitist, and as far as Tanya was concerned, the Fire Nation was damn lucky Fire Lord Ajalon had seen sense at the last minute and named Oze heir to the throne. It had been obvious to her that Iroh was a bad influence on Zuko from the get-go. Doubtlessly he thought that if he could weasel his way into his nephew's heart, he'd be in a position to influence him if Oze revoked Zuko's banishment and renamed him heir to the throne. That was why she'd insisted on ditching the old coot back in the Earth Kingdom. Yet despite her efforts, he'd somehow stowed away on her fleet, and it didn't take a genius to figure out who must have helped him. Zuko. Tanya hissed, rounding on the scarred prince. What is he doing here? We had a deal. I was explicitly clear that Iroh was to remain behind. A deal you never had any intention of honoring. Iroh countered, taking a few steps forward so that he, Tanya and the Avatar formed a perfect triangle around Zuko. Tanya scoffed. Are you calling me a liar? I hope you have some evidence to back up that accusation. I'm the one in control of this situation, so what reason would I have to lie? The same reason you murdered Admiral Zhao and framed the Avatar for it. Iroh replied calmly. Because you are afraid. What? What? Afraid? Her? Of a bald child who could conjure a light breeze? Absurd. Utterly absurd. She was a veteran of a world war. She'd charged fearlessly into volleys of cannon fire. Dueled maniacs in the skies above blazing cities. She hadn't been afraid of anyone since. Since the girl who leveled fortresses with a single shot. Since the girl who rose unharmed from the rubble again and again like a damn zombie. Since the girl who being forged into a living weapon for the sole purpose of hunting her down. Wait, you're the one murdered Zhao. The Avatar interjected, horror and confusion warring across his face. But why? He was on your side. Tanya ignored him. Iroh was playing mind games, but the truth was he had no power here. There was only one person she needed to convince. Zuko, don't tell me you're buying any of this rubbish. She began, fixing her eyes back on the banished prince. He looked unsure, but his hold on the spirits hadn't wavered. As long as she kept Zuko on her side, she had the hostages, and that meant that she won. I told you I would help you capture the Avatar, and here he is bound in chains in front of us. How have I not honored my word to the letter? Her logic was faultless. How could Zuko possibly doubt her when the evidence was right in front of him? That's true. Zuko, damn his indecisiveness, seemed mostly convinced, but still looked to Iroh to refute her. Damn it! The old bastard had done a good job of training his nephew to turn to him for advice. Because this is more than just a trap. Iroh replied gravely. The lines of his face hardened into a scowl. Tanya doesn't not mean to just capture the Avatar. She plans to execute him. Execute? Zuko couldn't believe it. There must have been a mistake. Sure, Tanya could be very intense at times, but even she'd draw the line at K***ing a captured 10-year-old boy in cold blood, Avatar or not. But then again, she stabbed Zhao in the back. No, he couldn't think like that. The orders from his father were to capture the Avatar, so that he might be securely incarcerated until the war was over and the Fire Nation's dominion over the world was assured. K*ling him would see him reincarnated somewhere in the water tribes to grow into a threat all over again. Tanya had always been one to follow orders and take the logical course of action. Executing the avatar was exactly the kind of short-sightedness she hated. Execute. The avatar stammered, drawing Zuko's eyes to the young nomad. He looked genuinely terrified, his round, youthful face petrified in a fear no 10-year-old should have to experience. To his own surprise, Zuko felt pity for him. He was just a child, forced to fill a role he'd never chosen. How could there ever be any honor in K*ling him? I imagine that it was the fire sages who told you the secret. Uncle continued, his eyes fixed on Tanya. Though they have strayed from their path now, once they were entrusted with finding, protecting and training the avatars born within the Fire Nation. Such organizations have existed in every nation across history, because when an avatar is young they struggle to control their avatar state. And if the avatar is K*led when in that state? He shook his head sadly. It is believed that they will never be reincarnated again. The avatar cycle will cease to be. What? The avatar could be permanently K*led. And Tanya planned to do just that? Zuko looked back to Tanya, waiting for her to point out the holes in Uncle's theory with her usual factual tone. It worried him when she didn't move a muscle. Tanya! He whispered. Suddenly, Tanya began to laugh. No, laughter wasn't the right word for it. Laughter was a happy, cheerful sound that raised the spirits of those who heard it. This did the opposite. Every note of Tanya's cackle stummed jarringly against his nerves like an out-of-tune harp. It was almost painful, and had a maniacal edge to it that cast a pall of dread across the area. And with the laugh came the smile. That horrible, predatory smile that never failed to make him feel like a rabbit trapped before a wolf. Fine. I suppose there's not much point in pretending anymore. Tanya didn't sound frustrated at having been caught. Quite the opposite in fact. Maybe it was just the laughter lacing her tone, but she sounded almost pleased about it. He's right. I K*led Zhao. And after tonight, I will be the one who K*led the avatar forever. Tanya. Zuko couldn't find the words. She really meant it. Despite all her oddities, he'd never genuinely thought Tanya capable of such remorseless violence. You don't get it, Zuko. Tanya snapped, her expression shifting into a rictus of fury at the drop of a hat. You know what your problem is? You lack resolve. That's the real reason why you fail time and time again to capture the avatar. All you care about is your own damn sense of honor. But we are at war, Zuko, and sometimes the needs of our nation require us to sully our hands with lesser evils to serve the good of a cause greater than ourselves. As long as an avatar exists, there will always be a symbol for those who resist the Fire Nation to rally behind. She drew herself to her full height. To be a Fire Lord means to prioritize the good of the nation above all else, even your own personal sense of right and wrong. Maintaining order requires necessary evils. You must be prepared to make difficult decisions for the greater good, whether they be getting rid of incompetent commanders, assassinating a politically dangerous child, or ever sacrificing a company of new recruits to ensure a wider victory. Zuko felt his own inner flame of anger spark to life. No. You're wrong. He declared firmly, the fire bringing him strength and resolve, and with it a clarity of mind he relished. This isn't the right way to face our nation's problems. It may seem like the easy solution in the short term, but if we build a new world using dishonor, then what we create will be stained with it forever. All we'll have will be a world full of traitors and murderers. Tanya looked at him with strangely pleading eyes. You're an idealist, Zuko, I can respect that, but you're too young to understand when to put your honor aside to do what must be done. She gestured wildly to the avatar. Take it from someone who's experienced fighting chosen ones before. If you lock him up in the boiling rock and throw away the key, some harebrained idiot with a daring plan and a miraculous lucky streak will somehow set him free. Trap him in a cage where he couldn't possibly access the elements, and he'll discover some hidden new way to bend something you could never have predicted. Assume he was K*led by a fall nobody else could have survived, and you can bet your ass that somehow he'll manage to. Give him the slightest opportunity, and the universe itself will bend over backwards to see him succeed against impossible odds. Because whatever spirits chose him to be their agent will pull in the very threads of destiny itself to protect their investment. She looked back to the avatar, a mad gleam in her eyes. The only way they'll ever stay down for good is if you do it yourself, in person, leaving absolutely zero chance that they could ever survive. Mark my words, Zuko, this may well be the only chance the Fire Nation will ever get to be rid of the Avatar for good. Don't let Iroh convince you otherwise. I'll still let you take the credit, you'll return home as the hero who not only defeated the Avatar, but ensured that he'd never threaten the Fire Nation ever again. No victory is worth sacrificing your morality for. Uncle interjected. Just hold your nerve for a minute longer, and everything that is rightfully yours will be restored. Tanya countered. Your sense of honor is one of your greatest strengths, Prince Zuko. Uncle replied. Trust in your heart. The choices loomed before him like two great doorways, one tempting him with sweet whispers of regaining everything he had lost, the other promising that he could keep the last thing he had left, his heart. Oh, but how appealing the sweet whispers were! After all his struggle and backbreaking work, hadn't he earned his reward? He was just one step away. I've spent years pursuing the Avatar. Years of searching, of fighting to survive. He began slowly. Tanya's eyes widened in victory, while the Avatars fell in defeat. Only Uncle continued watching impassively, listening without judgment for him to finish making his choice. Zuko looked up at the weeping, wounded moon, and raised the bags containing the captive spirits. I can keep trying a little longer. Panic flashed across Tanya's face as she realized what was happening, and she leapt forwards, but it was already too late. Zuko threw the bags. They sailed in an ungraceful arc, landing with a splash in the nearest waterway. Tanya made to pursue it, but another wall of fire sprung up to block her path as Uncle intervened. As the water fully enveloped the bags, the drawstrings loosened, allowing the captive spirits within them to struggle free. The black and white koi circled one another in happy reunion, before turning in unison and swimming down deep into the depth of the ocean. High up above in the sky, the moon began to twinkle with faint silvery lights. They spread quickly across the reddened surface, healing the bloody hue, until a few seconds later the moon was back to its previous silvery glow. And all at once, every waterbender felt their powers come flooding back into them. Chapter 51. No. A storm of emotions raged through Tanya as she watched the bags sink into the depths of the ocean, fear, betrayal, but most of all white-hot anger. Had it not been for Iroh's wall of fire, she'd be halfway through burning the rest of Zuko's treacherous face off right now. A perfect victory had been right in their hands, and he'd thrown it all away. At the mere sight of his father he fell to his knees, weeping and trembling like a newborn baby. That's why the Fire Lord banished him. He doesn't have the mettle to be the ruler our nation would need him to be one day. Zhao's words from the day Zuko's ship came crawling into their port came to mind. Despite the things he'd done, Zhao hadn't been wrong about everything. Come to think of it, Zuko had betrayed her trust that day too, when he tried to keep knowledge of the Avatar's return to himself. Never again. She swore to herself, fighting to bottle up the storm inside before she lost control of herself. I'll never trust Zuko again. But I'll have to act quickly to salvage this situation. The Water Tribe had doubtlessly realized the moment it happened that their bending was back, and would now be empowered by the full moon again. However, that no longer mattered. During the hours that the red moon had hung in the sky, their forces had been absolutely decimated by her trap. The Fire Nation outnumbered them by about 20 to 1, and the Water Tribes were still surrounded and disorganized. There was only one wild card that could ruin everything if given the chance. Tanya's glare flickered to the Avatar, still struggling against the heavy chains that bound him. She'd been confident that she could take on the Avatar state when the moon was red, with his water bending gone and no earth around to bend, his strength was effectively halved. Now that the moon was back though, she'd be challenging a phenomenally powerful waterbender on a plateau of sheet ice. Provoking him into the Avatar state and trying to execute him personally didn't seem like such a wise idea now. But she also knew how the Avatar cycle worked. K*LL him as a regular boy now, and he'd be reincarnated among one of the Water Tribes. After tonight she'd have control of the North Pole, and the South Pole didn't have enough fight left in it to resist if she brought her fleet down there next. She could establish a firm Fire Nation presence on both poles, set up traps and patrols, and wait patiently for the day when the next young Avatar discovered their powers. When that happened she could repeat this moment all over again. Yes, it might take another decade of waiting, but the Avatar, and through him being X, would no longer be a threat to her. All she had to do was K*LL the Nomad Boy here and now. There was no battle cry, no loud warning or rageful shriek as Tanya burst towards him, jets of fire spewing from her feet. Iroh looked like he wanted to intervene, but by then her soldiers had already engaged him and Zuko. The Dragon of the West tore through them like wet paper, but it still bought her the seconds she needed. The only ones who could defend the chained avatar were the southern tribe peasants. The boy threw some manner of projectile at her that Tanya swerved around with ease. Correction, the only one who could defend the chained avatar was the southern tribe girl. With a curving motion like a swimmer swinging their arms back during a backstroke, the girl melted the ice in front of her and made it surge up into a towering blockade of swirling water. It was the sort of technique common sense dictated you avoid and go around, but Tanya was not willing to waste even a second of time. One hand shot forward to unleash a bolt of intense, bright flame that exploded into a burst of hissing steam the moment it hit the water wall, evaporating a huge chunk out of it. The water immediately moved to flow back into the empty space, but Tanya was quicker. Her feet burned ever brighter as Tanya pushed her jet propulsion technique to its limits, rocketing forward like a human missile. Her skin stung and crackled as she dove headfirst into the cloud of boiling steam she'd created, then immediately splashed into the wall of freezing cold water. Colliding with water at such high speeds battered her arms, head, and neck, but thanks to her fire bolt the area she charged into was thinner than the rest. The momentum from her jets carried her straight through the wall, bringing her face to face with the avatar on the other side. Checkmate. The water tribe girl hadn't expected her to push through the wall, and wasn't in the right pose to make a defensive motion in time. The avatar's eyes were wide, his body paralyzed by fear as Tanya descended upon him, her good arm wreathed in flame as it swung down towards his head. Crack! Tanya jerked to the side like a puppet with its strings cut as something hard and heavy smashed into the side of her face, knocking a tooth out of the corner of her mouth. What the hell was that? Yes! Boomerang! The water tribe boy cheered. The extra second was all the time the avatar needed to collect his wits. With a huff and a puff so deep they'd make a big bad wolf proud, he blew as if his life depended on it. Which it very much did in this case. While that might not have been much for a regular person, for a master airbender the result was like standing behind the turbine of an aeroplane. In the blink of an eye Tanya was picked up and thrown backwards into the sky so high she could look out across the entire battlefield. Liberal bursts of fire soon had Tanya halt her rapid ascent, but a glance back down confirmed that those few seconds had been all the time needed for her trap to collapse. Her soldiers had been defeated, her tanks toppled, and Zuko and Iroh were fleeing whilst the southern tribe siblings finished prying off the hastily constructed manacles from the avatar's wrists. Tanya snarled in fury and dove back towards them, but the distance was too great. The moment he was free, the avatar picked up his staff and sprinted across the ice. She forgot sometimes that the avatar could, under the right conditions, sprint as fast as the wind. With a flat, open space in front of him, those conditions had been met. The young nomad picked up speed at an alarming pace, galloping towards the battlefield like a well-bred horse. Currents of air gathered together in a swirling mass behind him, becoming so large and powerful that they became visible, dirty grey blob, like a localized hurricane was trailing after him. The avatar rocketed behind the line of soldiers that stood between the water tribe warriors and Agnicolae. The gathered gale behind him hit them half a second later like a speeding freight train, snatching them off their feet as if they weighed no more than feathers. Tanya watched with horror as the line of soldiers that she had put so much planning and effort into positioning at the perfect place was wiped off the board in a matter of seconds. And deep inside her, whatever tight lid Tanya kept on her temper suddenly snapped. Paco watched with amazement as the soldiers behind them, the metaphorical bars to the cage he'd foolishly led his warriors into, were sent flying through the air like rag dolls. First the blessed moon had returned, and now the encirclement was broken. The avatar had really come through for them. Chief! We must flee! He called out, knowing that this opportunity would not last for long. Though it pained him to admit it, Agnicolae had fallen. Even with the full moon's power, they no longer had enough men to resist the Fire Nation's advance. But on the other side of the city lay the pathway out into the northern wastes. If they could retreat, they could find shelter in another village and form the core of a resistance movement. The Fire Nation may occupy the North Pole, but they would spend every minute paying for it with blood and tears. When no answer came from the chief, Paco looked over his shoulder to find him lying face down in the snow, his chest no longer rising and falling. The aging waterbender bit back his grief and looked forwards again. There was no time to mourn. With me, warriors! Retreat! Make for the wastes! They needed little encouragement. Like a great stampede, the warriors of the north turned and ran, calling their final reserves of stamina to make a dash back to the gate. But of course, the devil of the South Sea would not let them go so easily. Get after them! Her shrieking voice cut through the night's air like the wailing of a banshee. The golden child of the Fire Nation looked a mess, her hair tangled and messy as if she'd been dragged through several bushes, and her face a mask of wild fury so uncontrollable that it seemed like she was on the verge of frothing at the mouth. There was some small pleasure in knowing that they had at least been able to drive the normally unflappable Admiral Tanya completely ballistic, but Paco had no time to savor it as the Fire Nation horde wasted no time following her orders. The ice shook as an avalanche of red and black armored soldiers charged after the northern warriors, hurling battle cries and fireballs alike. Chapter 52. Sokka hated retreating. It was the right decision to make, he knew that. Tanya's strategy had outfoxed the north, and with the sun due on the horizon in no more than an hour there was no tactical ploy he could think of to turn the tides back in their favor. Retreating to fight another day was the best way to make sure that the northern tribes had any hope for freedom in the future. But that didn't mean he had to like it. Being forced to run while the enemy yet again uprooted people's lives and stole away their homes left a bad taste in his mouth. Fireballs whizzed and sizzled as they flew aimlessly over his head, smashing into the icy walls of buildings as the northern warriors raced through the main streets of Agnikal. Despite being younger and far better rested than them, Sokka found himself struggling to keep up with the punishing pace the warriors were setting. They could not afford the leisure of saving their energy with the Fire Nation hot on their heels, and for many it was only the fear of death that kept their legs moving. Yet if he was struggling with the pace, for Yue it was torture. She was a princess in a society that shunned female warriors, and the expectations that she be demure and ladylike had robbed her of the opportunity to develop any real stamina. Even with all her effort and willpower, her body simply did not have the muscle strength to keep up. Sokka had stayed by her side to offer whatever help he could, but there was only so much that he could do. Eventually something had to give. Yue let out a gasp of pain as her foot slipped and landed on its ankle. She stumbled, seconds away from falling, but Sokka was immediately there to scoop her up and carry her. "My foot!" she hissed. "I think I sprained it." "It's all right. Leave everything to me." Sokka panted back, even as his legs wobbled and shook under the burden of the extra weight. He could do this. So what if his muscles were already burning? He could take it. Water warriors were passing them from behind with increasing speed, and the din of the Fire Nation horde grew steadily louder. It was Yue who realized it first. "Sokka, you have to leave me behind." "What? No. Never." Sokka gasped out between heavy breaths, refusing to even consider the idea. "I'm not going to abandon you. I'm holding us both back, Sokka. At this rate we'll both be caught." Yue replied. "Then we'll be caught together. My job is to protect you. Oh Sokka! Brave Sokka!" Yue's cool hand cupped his cheek, and Sokka looked down into her sapphire blue eyes. Even with an army chasing after them she did not look afraid. Instead her expression was one of wonder as she drank in the sight of his face, as if expecting it to be the last time she ever would. "Your job, your destiny, isn't to protect me. It's to protect him." She nodded upwards, where the last of the air nomads bravely rode his sky bison steed, swinging his staff and conjuring howling winds to deflect the fireballs raining down upon them. "He's going to need you, Sokka," Yue continued. "Someone with ingenuity. Someone resourceful. Someone who can see alternative paths where others see no choice but to fight. Because this won't be the last you see of Tanya. I'm sure of it." Her eyes trailed over to the golden-haired star that hung in the sky above the Fire Nation forces like an omen of evil, hurling fireballs with vengeful vigor. "I think she means to hunt Aang to the ends of the world. And if she can't defeat him in direct combat, then she'll set a trap for him just like she did today. It's going to take someone capable of outsmarting her to keep Aang safe, and I believe that's the role the spirits chose you for. But I..." Tears were forming at the edges of Sokka's eyes, but he couldn't spare a hand to wipe them away. His voice wavered under the physical and emotional stress thrust upon him. "What about what I want? I don't want to leave you. I know." Yue's lip trembled as she struggled to contain her own feelings. "I don't want to leave you either, but this is bigger than the both of us. Your place is with the Avatar, and mine is with this city." Sokka choked back a sob, the harsh realization of what he had to do dawning on him. He wished so badly that it wouldn't, that he could blindly cling to the hope that if he just kept running everything would work out in the end. But he was too smart for that. Reluctantly, his footsteps began to slow. Yue smiled up at him. "This isn't the end, Sokka. One day, when this war is over and peace has returned, we'll see each other again." She slipped out of his arms, wincing slightly as her injured foot touched the floor, and laid an arm on his shoulder. "Now run Sokka. Run! And so he did. Every step tore at his chest, as if he were forcibly pulling apart 1,000 tiny strings keeping him bonded to you, but Sokka forced himself to keep planting one foot in front of the other. One short sentence came to mind. 3 little words he found himself desperately wanting to say. He looked over to see you standing proudly before the Fire Nation horde, smiling at him serenely, and the words bubbled up in his throat, begging to be released. But how could he say them when he'd left her behind? Shame strangled the words on the tip of his tongue, and a heartbeat later the opportunity was gone. The sea of red and black swallowed you up like a hungry beast. Sokka ran. He ran and ran and ran, completely numb to the burning ache in his muscles and fireballs exploding around him, until he'd caught up with the Water Tribe warriors. And if any of them noticed the tears streaming down his cheeks, not one of them said a word. There it is. The path. Relief crashed into Katara like a wave on a beach as the road leading up the glacier into the northern wastes came into sight. The horizon was beginning to turn orange, and everybody knew that the moment the sun peaked up, the firebenders pursuing them would gain a fresh burst of power. Yet if they continued their current pace they should escape the city just in time. Yet that wave of relief quickly receded, replaced by a dry horror as another realization struck her. The path is exposed. She cried. Indeed, the winding road that led the way up was carved into the side of the glacier, with no walls of barricades to protect them. We'll be easy targets. The Fire Nation will stay down here and shoot at us. Beside her, Master Pakku nodded grimly. Yes, that is true. Unless, of course, someone holds them off. What are you saying? Katara asked, only to realize that Pakku had stopped running, and had turned around to face the oncoming horde. Master! We still have a few minutes left of moonlight. You must lead them to safety, Katara. Pakku continued, his body settling into a low, flowing fighting stance. I will hold the Fire Nation off until the sun rises. But Master! Katara swallowed the lump in her throat. They'll *LLU. I have lived a long and rich life, Katara. I have known many wise and loyal friends, and passed down the wealth of my knowledge to a student truly worthy of it. But Aang, he needs a water-bending master. Katara pleaded. Pakku offered her a tight, but unmistakably fond, smile. Then he'd better get used to calling you Master Katara, hadn't he? He began to sway his arms, and all around them the city of ice began to sway with him. As the last few retreating warriors made it past him, Pakku clenched his fists, and hundreds of tendrils of ice and water, like the limbs of a great kraken, burst from the ground around him, blocking the path between the Fire Nation and the northern warriors. Run, Katara! Don't look back! And may the spirits of the moon and ocean watch over you on your journey. And so she ran. And even as she reached the foot of the pathway, and the bloodthirsty roars of the Fire Nation soldiers morphed into cries of fear and the rushing of torrential water, Katara respected her master's wishes and did not look back. She kept her eyes on the path ahead, encouraging each and every warrior she passed on her way up to keep on running just a little bit further, and never stopping to watch Pakku's final battle. It was strangely hard to keep track of time. Later, Katara wouldn't be able to decide whether it had felt like hours had passed or just a couple of minutes, but before she knew it she found herself standing at the top of the path, the snowy tundra of the northern wastes stretched out before her. They were just in time too, for right at that moment the light of the rising sun swept over her, signaling that a new morning had come. The night of the red moon had come to an end, and with it the siege of the north was over. It had been a night filled with death, heartbreak, and the bitter taste of defeat, but the last warriors of the northern water tribes had snatched themselves from the jaws of certain death to fight another day. Chapter 53. Tanya wasn't sure if she should feel incredulous, disappointed, or just downright murderously angry at the fact that her entire army hadn't been able to push its way past a single old man. Perhaps all three? Some very intensive training lay in store for her entire fleet in the near future. Admittedly, that old man was perhaps the most powerful waterbender in the world, on the night of a full moon, fighting with the reckless abandon of those fully prepared to sacrifice their life. And admittedly her forces had been bottlenecked into trying to go directly through him by the buildings, all of which were made of ice that he could twist to his will with a twitch of his finger. But even so, one man should not be able to hold back an army by himself. It was a disappointing performance from an army that she'd been rather pleased with up until now, and a mistake that had allowed the last of the Water Tribe warriors to escape. Now her conquest of Agnikal would forever be marred by guerrilla attacks from die-hard rebels. The Fire Lord would not be happy about that. It was just as the last of the rebels escaped into the northern wastes that dawn finally broke, and its amber light seemed to steal the strength away from the old man the moment it struck him. His wall of tendrils collapsed into nothingness, and the elderly sage sank to his knees, gasping for breath at the epicenter of a battlefield strewn with shards of ice and fallen firebenders. Tanya hovered down to the ground in front of him, her flaming feet hissing against the cold ice for a moment before she cut the jets and stood upon solid ground once more. She took a moment to breathe deeply, reining in her temper, and smoothed out her tousled hair. It was shameful to admit that she'd lost herself to wrath for a moment back there, but such was not inexcusable during the crescendo of a pitched battle. Now that it was over, professionalism dictated that she behave with logic and discipline once again. That was quite a last stand. I have to admit, your technique was breathtaking to behold. She began slowly, looking down upon the exhausted old man. But you do realize that you've signed your death warrant, don't you? You have cost many of my men their lives, and caused me no small number of future headaches by letting your comrades escape. You must die, here and now. I trust you understand that it's nothing personal. The old man let out a bitter laugh. It was personal for me. *LLED my friend. Tanya raised an eyebrow. I did. Admiral Zhang. I see. Figures that an old traitor would have befriended the enemy. Well, I hope the knowledge that you both made valiant last stands against the inevitable gives you some level of comfort in the next life. The Fire Nation's victory is not inevitable. The old man refuted gently, looking up to stare her directly in the eyes. As long as there are those in any nation willing to take a stand against tyranny, the Fire Nation will never truly be victorious. Tanya scoffed. How poetic. She raised her hand, and a ball of fire sprung to life in her palm. I hope it was a belief worth dying for. Her hand came down, the fire flared, and the wise master Paco was no more. Tanya turned her back on the battlefield, looking out across the city she had conquered in the light of the new morning. Her plan had not gone as perfectly as she'd hoped, and the Avatar was still at large, but a wise manager did not dwell only on their mistakes. She had achieved her primary task of conquering Agnicolae, the key to the North Pole, where all before her had failed. Fame had not been her driving motivation, but the thought of having her name immortalized in history for this did bring a small smile to her face. And although she had failed to secure the ocean and moon spirits as hostages, she had managed to pick up a decent consolation prize in their place. Her eyes trailed down as a group of 4 soldiers arrived, frog marching a young woman with silver hair between them who hobbled with as much dignity as she could. A sly smirk crossed Tanya's face, and she drew herself up to her full height and puffed her chest out, every bit the picture of the victorious commander that she was. Princess Yue. She greeted, perhaps just a hint of smugness lacing her tone. I regret to be the bearer of bad news, but the body of your father has been identified. As his sole heir, it now falls to you to take responsibility for your people during this period of tumultuous change. Her confirmation of the father's death had a great impact on her. It was clear to see from the flash of raw pain in her eyes and the way her breath hitched. Yet with impressive mental fortitude, Princess Yue fought to bury her grief deep down, and within a few seconds had repaired a hasty, if somewhat clearly faked, composure. What is to become of my people? She asked quietly. It was touching that her first thoughts went to her subjects when her own safety was in such a questionable position. Those who fled will be declared exiles and terrorists, publicly renounced by yourself and all others in positions of authority, and hunted down on sight. Tanya answered bluntly. Those who have remained in the city however will be welcomed gratuitously as second-class citizens of the Fire Nation. They will be given meaningful employment, access to our technology, and the protection of the forces that will remain here to keep the peace. Those who work hard and obey the rules of the new governor will even be allowed to apply for first-class citizenship once everyone has settled into the new social order. As a whole, Agnicolae will prosper as a great and respected colony of the Fire Nation. She began to pace around the captured princess, the guards backing off without a word at her approach. You, however, Princess Yue, will accompany me to the palace of the Fire Lord. A guest room will be prepared for your extended stay, and you will assist our noble Fire Lord in establishing the new diplomatic treaties and legal policies necessary to maintain order across the North Pole during its integration into the Fire Nation. Your services may be called upon to help us deal with any issues caused by the rebels, but otherwise your safety and luxury will be guaranteed. I am to be your prisoner then? Your hostage? Yue replied. Tanya stopped her pacing and grinned wolfishly. Indeed. Just think of yourself as a fish in a pond, and try not to bite the hand that feeds you. She turned to the soldiers and nodded. Take her to the flagship, and make sure she's comfortable in the guest quarters. It's going to be a long journey back to the homeland. The soldiers snapped a salute and marched away, taking the princess with them. Once she was far enough away, Tanya flew upward in a quick blast of fire to perch atop a nearby building, and looked down upon a sea of faces as her troops stared up at her expectantly. Soldiers of the Fire Nation! She yelled, her voice carrying easily across the city and silencing the final murmurs of conversation. You should be proud. She raised her arms and gestured towards the city around them. You should be proud, because despite hundreds of years of invasions this city has never been captured. But you have captured it, because you are cunning. You should be proud, because the rest of the world said that a waterbender army could never be beaten on the night of a full moon. But you have beaten them, because you are strong. He raised her arms, her voice filling with passion. You should be proud, because the world has never before been unified beneath the banner of one great nation. But today you have brought us another step closer to that dream, because you are the loyal, the brave, the unstoppable soldiers of the Fire Nation. You should be proud, because you have won. A great cheer erupted from the assembled soldiers, echoing throughout the icy streets and filling the hearts of the natives cowering within their houses with dread. Victory was the Fire Nation's on this day, and another corner of the world was dragged kicking and screaming into the enlightened grace of the Fire Lord's rule. And before long the rest of the world would follow suit. On that day, when there was nowhere left to hide, Tanya knew that she would meet the Avatar again. And on that day he would not escape her again. Chapter 54. The Fire Nation was alive with the sounds of revelry. The greatest war hero of their generation, the mighty Admiral Tanya, had returned home from her daring siege of the north, and in every town and city across the homeland the people drank, danced, and sang in celebration of her victory. Endless streams of fireworks lit up the night sky, colorful parades marched through the streets, and children laughed and giggled as wily merchants dyed their hair golden blonde. Wine and laughter flowed like water, and not one of Tanya's soldiers had to buy their own drinks. High up in the royal palace the merriment had taken on a far more refined, though still every bit as debauched, air. Noble lords and ladies quaffed fine wine and gorged on entrees, whole exotic dancers glided around in bright, tight clothing. The buzz of conversation hummed in the air, for gossip was the heart and soul of the palace intrigue, and it was no surprise to any who cared to eavesdrop whose name was on everyone's lips. Private investments in navy expeditions have been skyrocketing ever since Admiral Tanya. But of course Tanya has always been a close friend of mine. I knew since I first laid eyes on her at her first tournament that Sun intends to seek her hand in marriage. I would never normally approve of a match with some peasant of course, but since it's Admiral Tanya we're talking about. It seemed like the whole nation was united in adoration for their golden child. Yet there was one person in the royal palace who did not feel like celebrating. You would never tell it from looking at her, for she had long ago mastered the art of concealing her true emotions, but praise for the returning conqueror was the last thing on her mind. Princess Azula was absolutely livid. She had always hated Tanya. She'd hated her from the moment the straw-haired little upstart had begun stealing her thunder back at the tournament that was meant to be her debut. By tying with Azula in the finals on that day, Tanya had created a dangerous impression in the minds of everyone who'd been watching, that the two of them were equals. That a princess of the Fire Nation, who held the blood of countless Fire Lords and had been personally trained by the most elite teachers in the country, was an equal to some orphan charity case picked up by the Fire Sages. Father had been furious. He'd never said it, or outwards showed any signs, but Azula knew he was furious. If the people got it into their heads that just any old urchin picked off the streets could match the heir to the throne, then eventually they'd start asking why the royal family deserved to be in charge in the first place. Fear was what kept people in their proper place, and Tanya's actions could serve to undermine that fear. That was why father had gone out of his way to bind Tanya into her friendship group. Some people said that it was wise to keep your friends closer but your enemies closer, but they were wrong. Father had shown her that your friends were your enemies, and would stab you in the back the moment they sensed weakness. By forcing Azula to take Tanya in as her friend, he was both punishing her for her failure and setting her the task through which she might redeem herself. Either Azula was to establish herself as the dominant one in their friendship, gain Tanya as her own personal pawn and let everyone see that she was Tanya's superior, or she was to defeat and humiliate her so publicly, so embarrassingly, that none would ever dare think that the two of them were equals again. And every time he'd invited Tanya to join them for dinner at the palace, dropped by to watch them sparring, or shared pieces of philosophy with her that he'd only told Azula before, he was subtly reminding Angela what would happen if she failed. Like her brother, she too could be cast aside if a more suitable heir presented itself. So Angela had tried. By the spirits, how she had tried! On the surface she smiled and offered the meaningless platitude that friends did, but underneath she plotted and schemed, threw herself into her studies and training, and took every possible opportunity that presented itself to prove that she was better than Tanya. She had to admit, having a proper rival had led her to discover a well of determination within herself greater than even she'd known she had. It let her keep standing just a little longer, fighting just a little harder, and persevering in the face of obstacles the old her might have given up on. But it was never enough. Every test she aced, Tanya aced too. Every fight she won would be followed by a loss the next time. Every challenge she overcame with cunning and guile, Tanya matched with strategy and brutality. Like two snakes wrestling to eat the other, they spun over and over in circles, outwardly keeping up the pretense of being friends, yet always looking for that fatal opening that would let them sink in their fangs. Neither of them could pull ahead of the other, and it galled Angela to admit that it ran her ragged just trying to keep up. Yet the one thing Angela had always clung onto, the one thing that reminded her that she really was superior no matter how many times the results suggested that she and Tanya were equal, was her birthright. She was a princess, next in line to be Fire Lord, and possessed all the benefits that title entailed. Her words had an authority that none could match, and her heritage gave her respect and power over all the Fire Nation. People would bow and scrape at her passing. That was something that Tanya, being common-born, could never match. Until she'd gone and made herself into a bloody war hero. "Ladies and gentlemen," the Master of Ceremonies announced, gesturing with one hand to the door behind him. "It is my great pleasure to announce the guest of honor. Please give a warm welcome home to the woman of the hour, the one and only Admiral Tanya." The crowd burst into applause as the door swung open with dramatic slowness, revealing the golden-haired girl in all her glory. Tanya's armor had been polished to the point that you could see reflections in it, the deep black and fiery crimson of the metal matched by a cape as red as wine, that flapped like a flag as she strode confidently forwards. Angela seethed as she saw the naked awe and reverence in the eyes of the nobles around her. Who in the Fire Nation would refuse a request made of them by their greatest war hero? Who would not grovel for her attention, or tremble at her fury? Tanya had found a way to get respect and authority close to that commanded by a princess, and had earned it through her own merit rather than have it handed to her. They had become more equal than ever now, and Angela loathed her for it. "I've been too reactive, too content to wait for opportunities. I need to start earning my own achievements." Golden eyes met her own, and Tanya politely excused herself from the mob of people swarming in to make connections with her and pushed her way over to Angela. As she approached, Angela's eyes darted over the pleasant smile that had come across Tanya's expression. As usual, she couldn't find a hint of falsehood to it, and if she didn't know better she might have thought that Tanya was being genuinely friendly. Tanya always had been just as good at disguising her real feelings behind the veneer of friendship as she was. "Angela. It's good to see you again after so long." Tanya greeted, offering only a small bow. So the little upstart thought she could get away with such informality now that she was a hero, did she? Well, Angela had a few tricks prepared to take the wind out of her sails. "Tanya. I always knew you'd come home safe and sound." Angela lied easily. "And just look at you. Only a few short years and you're already an admiral. That's got to be setting some kind of record." Tanya laughed with false modesty. "What can I say? I got lucky, I suppose. What about you? How have things been at the palace?" Was that a subtle dig at her for staying safe at home? "Oh, it was on. Nothing much, just more training, studying and the usual politicking." Her lips curled into the smallest of smug sneers. "Although I did master the lightning generation technique. My instructors say I don't have a hair out of place." Lightning generation was a technique that Tanya found herself unusually abysmal at. For whatever reason she seemed simply incapable of separating her positive and negative chi, and her attempts to do so in the past had usually blown up in her face. It wasn't every day that Tanya discovered something she wasn't good at, so naturally Angela took every opportunity to rub her own natural talent for it in her face. Tanya, however, did a perfect job of faking being impressed. "That's quite the achievement," she replied. "I was on the receiving end of a lightning bolt once. It did a real number on my arm. If it hit me in the chest I'd probably be dead. More's the pity it didn't then." Angela thought snidely. But that was done by a man so old he probably remembered the air nomads. "I don't think anyone's mastered that technique before reaching adulthood." Tanya continued. You really are incredible, Angela. Incredible, she says, at a party thrown in her honor for literally turning the moon off. What a condescending viper. Oh please, we all know that if anyone's incredible around here, it's you. Angela replied with false sincerity. A devious smirk flashed across her lips. Although you should be careful. I've heard some nasty rumors floating around about you. Rumors? Tanya asked. Yes. They arrived on shore when you did. Some of the soldiers who were present when you tried to capture the Avatar have been saying some pretty nasty things about you. Angela whispered conspiratorially. Apparently you admitted that the Avatar wasn't the one who actually murdered Admiral Zhao. They say that the one who confessed to being the true culprit was none other than yourself. There. That fraction of a second when the shoulder tensed, the fleeting flash of panic in her eyes, was all the tell Angela needed to confirm the truth. So it really was true then? Straight-laced Tanya had murdered her own superior in order to usurp his position. Father would be impressed. Yet it had been sloppy of her not to dispose of the soldiers who knew the truth, and now Angela had the perfect blackmail material to hold over her head. If she didn't want her hard-won title of hero to turn into a mark of shame, Tanya would have no choice but to become her obedient little pet. Thank Agni she'd thought to embed a spy on Tanya's ship back when she'd first set sail. Few people have heard it right now, but nothing spreads faster than a nasty little rumor. Angela continued sarcastically. I'd hate for an odious lie to stain your golden reputation. Would you like my help suppressing it? I know the right people to talk to in order to make this all go away. The unspoken threat behind her words of course being, that with a word, she could have those same people inflame the rumors to the point that they reached every ear in the nation. Angela. Tanya looked lost for words, and the princess of the Fire Nation bit back the urge to laugh in her face. They were at a party after all. Even so, it felt indescribably good to finally see her arch-rival squirm. You're the best. Chapter 55. Angela. Tanya looked lost for words, and the princess of the Fire Nation bit back the urge to laugh in her face. They were at a party after all. Even so, it felt indescribably good to finally see her arch-rival squirm. You're the best. Wait, what? In the blink of an eye Tanya was beaming at her like some bright-eyed goofball. What on earth was she playing at? Seriously, you're the best friend anyone could ever ask for. Tanya continued joyfully, all traces of nervousness gone. It's heartening to know that you've always got my back. But don't worry, I can handle this on my own. Before Angela could get a word in, Tanya had turned around and strode over to the nearby stage, plucking a glass of wine from the tray of a passing waiter as she did and a spoon from a nearby table. She stepped up on stage, tapping the cutlery against the glass to make a ringing sound that caught everyone's attention. All conversation fell silent as the audience waited with bated breath to hear what their hero had to say. My noble countrymen! I am grateful beyond words that you have all come here to honor me tonight. Tanya began, her commanding voice ringing as clear as a bell across the palace. Yet in truth I only stand victorious here before you tonight because I stood upon the shoulders of a giant. There is a man who should have been standing beside me. A man who deserves to be honored more than I do. A man who sacrificed his life so that I might finish the work he started. Tanya raised her glass into the air, and the audience mimicked her action. By tradition, the one who leads the conquest of a city may invoke the right to rename it, signaling its rebirth as a part of our great nation. Well, I invoke that right now. Henceforth, I declare that Agnikale shall be renamed in memory of the man who worked so hard, without thought for recognition, to bring the northern water tribes into the light of the future. So please, ladies and gentlemen, join me in a toast to the future prosperity of the Fire Nation's newest colony, the city of Zhao. The audience cheered and joined her in a toast, whispering to each other about what a loyal and selfless young woman she was, and never noticing how the glass Angela held had begun to crack ever so slightly under her grip. That conniving little bitch! Nobody would believe that Tanya could be Zhao's real murderer after word of that speech got out. The right to rename captured cities was afforded to generals as a way of recognizing their achievements, and to date had only been used to rename somewhere after the general themselves in a vain attempt to immortalize their own name, or after whatever wealthy lord the general was hoping to impress. It had never been used to honor the memory of a fallen soldier before, and you could bet that the ignorant masses would lap it up when they heard. When stories were told of Tanya's victory, Zhao would now forever be cast as the wise and kindly mentor who led her to greatness. And that same wave of goodwill would strangle the rumors of the truth in their crib. And so once again, Angela had failed to pull ahead. As the applause ended, a loud cough drew everyone's attention, and all eyes turned to the master of ceremonies once again. "Ladies and gentlemen, please follow me to the throne room," the man requested, and all at once a current of excitement ran through the crowd. It was incredibly rare for the Fire Lord to invite so many people into his throne room at once, and for most it would be their first time standing in the room where perhaps the most political power in the entire world resided. Angela slipped into the crowd as they bustled and shoved their way as politely as possible through the doors to where her father waited. The throne room was as imposing a sight as ever. The veil of flames that separated the Fire Lord from the petty concerns of mere mortals cast long, dark shadows. Li and Lo, the two ancient advisors to the throne, sat silently before the veil. Whether out of reverence of the Fire Lord's power or because the heat from the flames was uncomfortable, nobody made to stand nearly as close to the veil as they did, and so Angela snagged herself a place at the front. On the other side of the room she noticed that Tanya had done the same. Once the room was quiet, the doors closed, and a small band of drummers around the edges of the room started to play, their slow, rhythmic pounding helping to build a sense of tension. Soon the doors swung open again, and a young woman walked in followed by 4 elite palace guards. She wore a low-cut red dress that was all Fire Nation style and colors, with golden bracelets and accessories that shone in the firelight. The black choker around her neck looked suspiciously like a collar, and perched within her snow-white hair was a silver headdress reminiscent of the one worn by the Fire Lord, but smaller and with a snowflake symbol atop. Princess Yue may have looked beautiful, but everything about her outfit just screamed that she was property of the Fire Nation now. A slave in all but name. The crowd parted as she passed, allowing her a direct route to the front. As she reached the front of the crowd she hesitated, until one of the guards gave her a warning nudge, and she knelt down into a low, submissive bow. "Fire Lord Oze," she began, the dead, toneless quality of her voice betraying that she was reciting a script. "In the name of the Northern Water Tribes I, Princess Yue, do hereby surrender to the enlightened rule of the Fire Nation, and accept all responsibility for the lives lost in our conflict. I recognize now that it was my ancestors' stubbornness and refusal to accept a peaceful union with the Fire Nation that led to so much unnecessary loss of life. With the spirits as my witness, I solemnly swear to guide my people to redeem this mistake by working hand in hand with our new Fire Nation governors, and denounce all cowards who fled the Battle of Agnicole." "Zhao!" Li interjected. "What?" Yu looked up, confused by the unexpected interruption. "Agnicole has been renamed Zhao," Lo stated. That news produced the most notable crack in the princess' valiant attempt at keeping a cool composure. A flash of anguish, of raw shame, before she ducked her head back into a low bow to hide it. When she spoke again, her tone had the quietest undertone of a wobble to it. "And denounce the cowards who fled the battle of Zhao, as rebels and traitors, fit to be executed for their treasonous deeds." The noble lords and ladies hollered their approval like braying farm animals, sneering and jeering at the torment of the captured princess. When there was no more humiliation to be had from her, the guards stood up, nudged her to do the same, and escorted her from the room. "Let Princess Yue's proclamation be known all across the land," Li announced. "On this day the Northern Water Tribe has officially declared its surrender." Lo continued. "Let it be known that the war between the Fire Nation and Northern Tribes is officially over," the twins declared in perfect unison. Again the nobles broke into furious applause, those nearest to Tanya clapping her on the back and smiling at her as if she'd won the entire war single-handed. With the show over, those at the back turned to leave, but everyone froze and listened intently when out of nowhere Fire Lord Oze suddenly spoke. "Angela! Tanya! Stay!" Whispered theories as to what the Fire Lord wanted to talk about buzzed around the room as Li and Lo shooed the gossipy nobles out, shutting the doors behind them so that the throne room fell deathly silent. On an unspoken cue both Princess and Admiral walked forwards until they stood in the same spot Yu had, and knelt down into deep bows. The silence lingered between them. Etiquette dictated that, excluding the offering of greetings, the Fire Lord spoke first in all conversations that took place in this room. It was a sign of respect and obedience, and sometimes Father liked to test people who sought an audience with him by waiting silently for minutes on end to see if they cracked under the pressure. But neither Angela nor Tanya were so weak-willed, and both kept their heads down and their mouths shut until, at last, Oze deigned to speak again. "Your victories are impressive, Admiral Tanya." Father's voice was as deep and rich as ever, his pace slow and certain, that of a man who knew he did not need to shout or speak quickly to demand attention. "The people praise your name. Tanya the Conqueror they call you. Tanya the Sun Fairy. Tanya the Moon Slayer. A proud grin crossed Tanya's lips. Thank you, Your Majesty. Yet you have failed me. Chapter 56. The people praise your name. Tanya the Conqueror they call you. Tanya the Sun Fairy. Tanya the Moon Slayer. A proud grin crossed Tanya's lips. Thank you, Your Majesty. Yet you have failed me. Those 5 words, delivered so emotionlessly, seemed to suck the heat out of the room in an instant. Tanya paled, her face falling, and Azula smirked wickedly at the look of unmistakable dread that crossed her features. It looked like the Golden Girl wasn't in everybody's good books after all. You had the rebel Northmen in your grasp, yet to let them get away. Ozai continued. You had the ocean and moon spirits in your grasp, but you let them get away. You had the Avatar in your grasp, but you let him get away. A quiet scoff, so soft it could easily be mistaken for a crackle of the flames. It seems that you gained butterfingers somewhere at sea. The Tanya I remember would have never been so sloppy. Your mistakes have created problems where there should have been none, and will take a great deal of effort to rectify. I apologize deeply, Your Majesty. Tanya replied, bowing her head as low as she could. I can offer no excuses. The Fire Lord was silent for a while, letting Tanya squirm under the weight of his judgment. Then he spoke again. Do you know why it was that you failed? Tanya hesitated, rightfully wary that one wrong answer here might cost her dearly. I got too hasty. So focused on one problem that I neglected to keep an eye on the other, and... Wrong. Ozai was angry. He did not shout, but his tone held that unmistakable bite of cold anger to it, and the flames before his flared up in response. With each word he spoke Tanya wilted further into herself. You failed because you put your trust in Zuko. He is weak. He has always been weak. I marked his shame onto his face long ago so that all might see it and know that he is not to be trusted. But you thought you knew better. You thought you knew better than I, his father, what sort of a man he is. Did you think you could walk back in here with him by your side as proof that I was wrong? Tanya was deathly pale now, perhaps realizing that her life was on the line. I am so sorry my lord. She stuttered. I didn't think. No, you didn't. Ozai cut her off. He was again silent for a handful of tense seconds, letting Tanya squirm beneath the weight of his disapproval, before letting out a heavy sigh. But you do not make a habit of failure. And you did succeed in conquering the North Pole, so I am inclined to overlook your failure this once. So long as it is only this once. Am I clear? Perfectly, my lord. Tanya replied quickly, clearly relieved to be out from under his scrutiny. Good. Then it is time to turn our attention to other matters. Ozai rang a bell, and immediately the doors swung open as Li and Lo returned, carrying a box between them. They set the box down in front of Tanya, then hobbled over to sit in front of the fire veil once again. Open it. Ozai commanded. Tanya did, and her eyes widened at what lay within. Inside was a model ship, though this one unlike any Azula had ever seen before. It had a huge, red bulb at the top that would surely push the rest of it down in water, and a flat base that was awful for steering. A hot air balloon. Tanya whispered reverently. You grasp its purpose with a glance. Li asked incredulously. You truly are a prodigy in the arts of flight. Lo finished. This technology was recovered from a battle at the Northern Air Temple. A last, unexpected gift from a treacherous inventor. Ozai continued. As you have grasped, when filled with hot air, this ship will sail through the sky, allowing us to traverse terrain that once would have taken days in mere minutes. As we speak, our factories have begun working overtime in order to produce a fleet of these within the next few months. Tanya looked up curiously. So quickly? Why the hurry? Because soon Sozin's comet will arrive, and the power of every firebender will be magnified tenfold. At that time this fleet will sail above a large chunk of the Earth Kingdom where the resistance against us is strongest, and rain fire down upon their heads, raising the land to ash. Though his face was hidden, Azula could sense her father smiling at the thought. It will break the back of the Earth Kingdom's war effort, and serve as a warning to any who would think of rebellion in the future. This sky fleet will become the key force for dealing with insurrections in the aftermath of the war, and so fear of its destructive power will be necessary to keep the populace in line until our culture has been fully spread and embraced across the world. Scorched earth tactics. Tanya mused contemplatively. Extreme, but it would be better for everyone to bring this war to a quick end at a moment of strength, no matter the short-term loss. I am glad you agree. Oze replied. Because this sky fleet is so important to both our immediate and future plans, I have decided it will require its own independent armed force directly under my command. The head of this force would be my right hand for the foreseeable future, above even the War Council, and second only to myself in authority. This head would need to be someone young enough to dedicate their life to the role, clever enough to devise entirely new battle strategies using aerial maneuvers, and ruthless enough to use the fleet's power without hesitation wherever needed. Their loyalty would have to be without question, and they would need to be so famous for their competence that none would dare complain about their appointment to such a lofty position. Angela grit her teeth so hard her jaw started to hurt. No prizes for guessing who that position of power would be bestowed upon. Who else but the famed flying fairy of the Fire Nation met all those criteria so obviously? Tanya seemed to reach that conclusion too, for her face split into a happy grin. My lord, you honor me. No, I do not. Not yet. Tanya's smile dropped again in an unspoken question, and the Fire Lord continued. I said I would not punish your failure, but neither shall I reward it. Your mistake cost the war effort dearly. It is true that you are the best candidate for the position, but until you have made reparations for your failure, you are not worthy of being my right hand. Ah, so that's where he was going with this. In Angela's brain everything suddenly clicked into place. Father had a mission in mind, something he felt that Tanya was needed for, and was setting up a carrot and stick to control her with. It was no great secret that Tanya desired a high status and rank within the military, so offering her the highest position it was possible to achieve would be an excellent motivator. The underlying threat of losing all that she had obtained so far if she failed would work just as well. Tanya bowed her head in subservience. What must I do to make amends, my lord? Oze allowed silence to hang between them again for a few seconds. Yet when he spoke, this time it was not to Tanya. Angela. Yes, father. Angela replied promptly. Iroh is a traitor, and your brother Zuko is a failure. I have a task for you. A sly smile spread across Angela's face as she anticipated his next words. This was turning out to be quite a wonderful night after all. They cannot be allowed to disgrace the family name any longer. The more they run free, the more dishonor they bring to our bloodline. As heir, it falls to you to rid our family of their shame. Oze declared sternly. And it is time that you began to take a more active role in the affairs of court. I charge you with the task of bringing your uncle and brother back home in chains, where they face my judgment for their betrayal of our nation. Angela dipped her head, masking the pleased curl of her lips. It will be done, father. Tanya. Tanya straightened at having the attention put back on her again. It was your mistake in trusting Zuko that allowed this shame to happen in the first place. To fix your mistake, I charge you with serving Angela in her task. You shall follow her orders as if they were my own. Serve? Tanya was being formally ordered to be her servant. Angela could barely contain herself from cackling with glee. This was the perfect chance to prove her superiority once and for all. Not only would she bring Zuzu and Iroh back to rot in prison, but she could also find a way to finally bring Tanya under her thumb. Then her victory would be truly complete, and nobody would question her rightful place as the next Fire Lord. It will be done, my lord. Tanya replied, shooting a quick glance over to Angela. She was as good as ever at hiding her emotions, but Angela was sure that she must be just burning up inside with envy right now. See that it is. Oze replied. I want all loose threads taken care of by the time the comet arrives. Nothing must be allowed to prevent the Fire Nation's final victory. Angela and Tanya rose in unison, taking the clear dismissal for what it was, and followed Li and Lo out of the throne room. The moment the doors slammed shut behind them, Tanya looked over to her. Hey, Angela. But Angela was already striding away without a word to her room. She did not care for whatever mind games or verbal sparring Tanya wanted to play right now. Already she was drawing up a list of the things she'd need to pack, and hatching the beginnings of 100 schemes to catch her pathetic brother. It was her moment to shine now, and Angela couldn't wait to get started. Chapter 57. Tanya watched with a pitying stare as Angela beat a hasty retreat to her room. Poor, proud Angela, rushing away to her room so that nobody would see her cry. She must be distraught right now. Crushed between the weight of duty to her nation and her love for her brother. How awful must it feel to imagine condemning your own sibling to imprisonment? Tanya's first instinct was to be outraged at Fire Lord Oze for placing such an unreasonable demand upon her, but after a few moments of consideration she came to see the logic in his decision. Zuko had betrayed the Fire Nation, and public opinion of him and Iroh was at an all-time low. Any soldier Oze entrusted this task to might ensure that Zuko had an accident on his way home, perhaps even a fatal one. The only one he could completely trust to ensure that his son was safely brought back home was his daughter, even if he would then be forced to lock him in a gilded cage for his crimes. Was that why he had specifically assigned her to be Azula's subordinate? No doubt he realized that Tanya hated Zuko for betraying her at the North Pole, so putting her in charge was out of the question, but Azula would clearly need some emotional support that only a friend could provide. If only Ty Lee was here, she'd always been the most supportive one in their friend group. Nonetheless, Tanya would try her best. Azula was the sort of friend that everyone should have, smart, loyal, and always pushing her to do her best. They hadn't seen each other in months, but the first thing Azula had done was warn her about those dangerous rumors spreading about the truth of Zhao's death. It was heartening to know that the princess was always looking out for her, and so the least she could do was look out for her in return. Her thoughts trailed to the Fire Lord as she looked back over her shoulder at the doors to the throne room. Oze was just as proud and stoic as his daughter, but he must be torn up inside too. First he'd been forced to injure and banish his son for his cowardice, and now was being forced to capture and jail said son again after he'd betrayed his own nation. How ashamed he must be, both of Zuko and of himself, for the things he was doing to his own flesh and blood. Yet he bottled it all up inside without a flinch in order to uphold the laws and justice of his nation. In the history of her old worlds it had been rare to find a king who'd put the laws of their nation before their own personal gain. What a truly selfless man Oze was. Zuko, do you have any idea how much pain you're putting your family through? She growled quietly, feeling that burning resentment for her old friend grow ever hotter. She would not physically harm Zuko, not when it would upset Azula so much, but somehow she was going to make him pay for all this. What would your mother think of you if she were still here? She'd be ashamed of the man you're becoming. Speaking of family, there was somewhere she probably ought to visit while she was ashore, and soon if she might be setting again in a few days. Returning to her guest room in the palace, Tanya shrugged off her armor and pulled on a long, hooded black cloak, then stole away into the night. She needn't have been worried about hiding her usually distinctive hair, because half the city seemed to have painted their hair in tribute to hers tonight. It was all sorts of flattering, and slightly embarrassing. While it was natural to celebrate military heroes in a time of war, she'd have been lying if she said she hadn't expected some level of resentment for her rather disrespectful use of the bodies of fallen soldiers. It seemed the Ministry of Propaganda had been hard at work suppressing the details of that particular aspect of her plan. After nearly an hour of walking, Tanya found herself upon the steps of a huge, traditional Fire Nation temple. She had never really considered anywhere in this world a home, but this place had been something like a permanent office space to her before she'd gone to the Royal Academy and later the Navy. It would be very inconsiderate of her not to pay back the expenses the Fire Temple had spent on raising her now that she could. She hammered sharply on the door, and waited until she faintly heard the sound of footsteps approaching on the other side. The door opened, revealing a short, portly yet jolly-looking woman in a nun's habit on the other side. The moment the nun caught a glimpse of a lock of blonde hair hanging down from beneath her hood, she let out an explosive, irritated sigh. Oh, for Agni's sake, not another one. Listen love, if you lot think you can waltz up here claimin' to be the poor lass long lost mother, I swear to the spirits I'll take ma slipper and leave a mark on the back of your EAD so red it'll make the moon jealous, you. Tanya flipped her hood back, a small smile crossing her lips as the nun's eyes widened with recognition. Good evening, Sister Vula. Vula was one of the servants at the Fire Temple. She was not a firebender, but arguably she and the other sisters did more work maintaining the temple and its day-to-day activities than the sages actually did. Spirits forbid that the wizened sages took time away from meditation to sweep their own floors after all. It was Vula and the sisters who'd actually looked after her and the other children as they were growing up, excluding the firebending training of course. Lil Tanya. Before Tanya could say another word, Vula had swept her up into a strong, hearty hug. Look at yet. You've grown into such a fine young lassie. It's been so long. It had been a rather long time, hadn't it? Since she'd left to board at the Royal Academy for Girls in fact. Tanya had never felt a particular emotional attachment to this place, but seeing Sister Vula like this made her feel a stab of guilt for not having so much as written a letter. Yes, well, it's been a busy few years. Vula laughed it off. Oh, don't you fret petal. It's always the same with you young UNS, running off without a trace for the first few years the moment you get your freedom. We're used to it, and we don't blame you. Life's an adventure, and those from this temple have to take every opportunity they can get to make something of themselves. But they always find their way back again eventually, once they've found their place in the world. She looked at her knowingly. And I dare say you've found yours. You're the darling of the nation, rubbing shoulders with generals and princesses. You've inspired many a wee laddie and lass around here. I'm glad to hear that. That's part of the reason I'm here actually. Tanya removed a box from beneath the folds of her robes that jingled heavily with the sound of metal coins. It pays very well to be an admiral, and I'd like to think this contribution will go towards helping the next set of children from this temple find their place in the world. Vula sniffed tearfully and pulled her into another hug. Oh Tanya, you always were a sweet little thing. She took the box and tucked it into her habit. I'll tuck this away somewhere the sages won't find it, save these pretty pennies for food and clothing. Speaking of food, why not come in for a hot bowl of soup? Thank you, but I should pass. I'm expected at the palace, and if I'm gone for too long. Oh pish those nobles and their lauded parties. They don't get to hog you all to themselves on your big celebration night. Vula replied. Besides, those little wafers on fancy trays they call food ain't nah for a growing young girl, especially one who works so hard. Come on in and get some real food down your neck. Before Tanya could get a word in, she was all but dragged inside. Vula led her through the empty corridors until they reached a small servant's kitchen, and plopped her down on a stool while she hurried over to a large iron pot on the stove. Afraid that most everyone else is out celebrating tonight. Just lil old me and the sages too old for partying about. Vula explained. But everyone's gonna want a belly full o' soup when they get back, so I'll be keepin' this pot bubbling away all night long. She poured 2 generous ladles of thick soup into a wooden bowl and set it in front of Tanya. Ah, what an unexpectedly nostalgic smell. Bread and soup had been for dinner most days of the week when she was younger, and though it was made with the cheapest ingredients available, the sisters had discovered some mysterious trick to make it taste not too bad. Tanya hadn't realized that she missed the taste until she brought a spoonful up to her lip. So what was with the reaction at the door? Have you been getting many blonde-haired visitors lately? She asked between mouthfuls. Vula sighed heavily. I peddle. Since news got back about your victory up north everyone's been talking about you, and it wasn't long until word got around that you grew up here. We've had 2 or 3 harlots rockin' up a day, claiming to be your long-lost mother. I guess they think it's an easy way to get rich. She snorted derisively. Course, they all make the mistake of painting their hair gold. Can't say I remember much about the girl that dropped ya off, but her hair was black as everyone else's. I'd have remembered gold. Tanya raised an eyebrow curiously. You saw my mother? Only for a few seconds. She knocked on the door and fled down the steps, so I only saw the back of her from a distance. She was a young thing, too young to handle the responsibilities of parenthood alone. It's a story we've seen over and over again these past 100 years. One parent goes to war, falls in battle, and the other finds they just can't manage on their own. Tanya had never paid much thought to who her birth parents in this world would have been. She'd had a mother and father in her first world, and had been mature enough to never need one in both worlds she'd been reincarnated into. Still, now that the subject had been brought up and she'd made her own life for herself, she couldn't deny feeling just a touch curious. I suppose I must have inherited my hair from my father then. She mused, then smiled sardonically. I suppose that rules out all the rumors of Zhao being my father. Vula chuckled good-naturedly. I peddle. Word around town these days is that you're the child of Agni himself, born with his sunlight in your hair. The priests have been more than happy to help that little rumor spread. She hummed thoughtfully. Although I guess that would explain the blanket. Blanket? Tanya asked. The one you were wrapped in when we found ya at the doorstep. Odd-looking thing it were. Hold on amo, I'm sure we stored it away somewhere in the cupboards. Chapter 58. Blanket? Tanya asked. The one you were wrapped in when we found ya at the doorstep. Odd-looking thing it were. Hold on amo, I'm sure we stored it away somewhere in the cupboards. Vula disappeared out the door for a moment, and reappeared clutching a pale yellow blanket. As she handed it over to her, Tanya immediately registered the familiar texture of rami, a textile almost exclusively produced in the Fire Nation. Yet the style was far from what she had seen in the Fire Nation before. If she had to draw equivalents, the art style in the Fire Nation was similar to that of feudal Japan in her original world. This however looked more like something she'd seen in museum exhibits on Aztecs, a pattern of bold lines that formed geometric shapes just as much with the empty space between them as with the ink itself. The blanket displayed 2 dragons in zigzagging serpentine shapes, one in red ink, the other in blue, spiraling like a yin and yang. "I've never seen anything like it," she murmured, honestly quite astounded by what she was seeing. Since the war began, the Fire Nation had been very strict on pruning anything they considered to not be a part of their proper culture from the homeland. As far as she knew, from the capital city to the smallest islands, everywhere produced the same style of art. Either this was made pre-war and had been remarkably well cared for, or had been made somewhere that had been able to keep its culture hidden from the rest of the nation. "I wonder where it's from." "'Fraid I've no clue either, Petal," Vula replied. "But if you'd like, you're welcome to keep it. Maybe it'll help you track down where your parents were from." Tanya considered it for a second, then shook her head and handed the blanket back. "Thank you, but no. I've never needed parents, so knowing who abandoned me isn't going to change much anyway. I think I'd rather focus on the future than the past." Vula nodded. "Suppose that's the pragmatic thing to do. All right then, Petal, I understand." She whisked away Tanya's now empty soup bowl, bringing the jolly smile back to her face. "Now then, why don't you share some stories with me about all the adventures you've had?" Aang was running as fast as the wind could carry him, but the maze of ice he was trapped in seemed to stretch on eternally into the distance. Crimson moonlight bathed the icy labyrinth, dyeing the walls and floor so red they looked like they were coated in blood. No, when he looked closer, Aang realized that they actually were bleeding. Frozen within the ice, he could just about make out the faces of warriors from the northern tribes, their expressions trapped forever in a rictus of pain. Their bodies were still and unmoving, but their eyes turned to follow him as he ran past, silently judging him for their failure to save them. "Ha ha ha!" An inhuman laugh, like the roar of a gigantic beast, echoed out across the maze behind him, and Aang whimpered in terror as he looked back over his shoulder. A towering giant of fire, its skin roiling like molten lava and its hair a wild web of beams of sunlight, stomped after him, incinerating the prisoners trapped within the maze's walls as it passed. Aang raced around a corner, only to stop in his tracks as he came face to face with a dead end. "Aang! Wake up!" Aang looked to the side, only to find Katara trapped in the walls of the maze next to him. He was pounding on the walls with his fist, trying to break through, but the ice would not budge. "Aang! Help us!" More pounding sounded out from behind him, and he turned around to see Yue and Sokka frozen in the walls on the other side. The temperature began to rapidly grow hotter as the fire giant loomed closer, their footsteps echoing louder and louder from back around the corner. "Don't leave us to die, Aang! Wake up! Save us, Avatar!" Bullets of sweat broke out across Aang's skin as the heat grew unbearably hot. A fierce hiss of steam caught his ears as a huge, fiery hand came around the corner and gripped the wall. "It was your duty to protect them. Wake up! Don't fail us again!" A great, grinning face peered around the corner, molten lips peeled back into an amused snarl. Now that he was close enough to make out the feminine shape of its face, Aang recognized the giant. "Found you, Avatar!" The fire giant bellowed in Tanya's voice. Aang backed away, but with the walls of ice surrounding him there was nowhere to run. He was trapped, powerless, helpless before the giant as it reached out a hand towards him. "Wake up, Aang! Wake up!" Aang's eyes shot open as he bolted up with a gasp, heaving in greedy, gulping gasps of the cool night's air. Katara was at his side, the cloth in her hand drenched with his sweat, and Sokka a few feet away with a waterskin at the ready. "It's okay, Aang, you're safe. Breathe," she said gently, carefully laying a hand on his back and soothingly massaging the space between his shoulders. Her touch helped to calm him, and as Aang continued to breathe deeply he felt his nerves slowly begin to relax. After about a minute his heart stopped pounding in his ears, and Aang exhaled deeply and took a deep swig from Sokka's offered waterskin. "Thanks guys," he whispered meekly, shifting from his sitting position into the cross-legged pose he usually used for meditation. Sokka and Katara shuffled their sleeping bags over, sitting on either side of him. They didn't say a word, nor did they look at him with any sort of judgment or pity. They simply let him take his time. It had been 10 days since they'd left the survivors of the battle in a friendly village and travelled on to the Earth Kingdom in search of a new master for Aang. Yet although time and a change of scenery had helped a little, it was still rare for a night to go by without at least one of them waking up screaming in the night. Nightmares had plagued the party ever since the siege of the north. Sokka's nightmares always featured Yue. They would be together in some sort of tense situation, chased by a mass of dark smoke, a wave of inky water, or some other elemental force of evil, and Yue would turn to him for help. Yet Sokka would always betray her, tripping her if they were running, pushing her if they were climbing, or even literally stabbing her in the back on one occasion. Then he would run, turning his back on her screams of betrayal as the darkness swallowed her up. Katara's nightmares featured Master Pakku, their mother, Yagoda, and other people that she looked up to as symbols of wisdom and teaching. She would be fighting by their sides against hordes of enemies, trusted with protecting their backs, when all of a sudden her control over the water would suddenly just snap. No matter how much she fought and flailed, her bending would not work, just like it had when the moon had turned red, and she would watch in horror as the enemies bypassed her and surrounded her mentors from behind. Sometimes they would just capture them, other times they would attack them, but always her mentors would look at her with blame and disappointment before they were taken away. Aang's nightmares were of prisons, cages and traps, all filled with either the warriors of the northern tribes or the airbenders he'd grown up with. There was a huge monster of some kind that prowled about devouring them, and no matter what Aang did he could never defeat it. The monster, which often bore a disturbing likeness to a certain golden-haired firebender, would shrug off his efforts as it devoured the people he wanted to protect. Then it would set his eyes on him, and no matter how hard he ran it would always catch him eventually. It was Katara who'd finally pulled them together after a week of sleepless nights and declared that something needed to be done. Yagoda the healer had taught her a little about the northern tribes' techniques for healing the mind, and so she had decided that, when one of them had a nightmare, the others would sit and listen to them without interrupting with their own thoughts or opinions. It had been a little awkward at first, but after that initial hurdle they'd all begun to find it quite nice to get things off their chest. Chapter 59. Yagoda the healer had taught her a little about the northern tribes' techniques for healing the mind, and so she had decided that, when one of them had a nightmare, the others would sit and listen to them without interrupting with their own thoughts or opinions. It had been a little awkward at first, but after that initial hurdle they'd all begun to find it quite nice to get things off their chest. It had been impossible to miss how often Tanya played a prominent role in all of their nightmares. It was her laughter that echoed out at Sokka from the darkness, her face Aang's monsters wore, and it hadn't taken much soul-searching to figure out why. Zuko, Zhao, and all the other servants of the Fire Nation they'd met so far had been a threat, and sometimes quite terrifying, but never something that they couldn't overcome with strength, courage, and ingenuity. Tanya had been the same at first, back when she was just the little girl with the strangely colored hair trailing along at Zhao's side. But not anymore. During the siege of the north, Tanya had proven that she was capable of breaking an entire nation, and was willing to murder not just her enemies, but even her own allies, to get what she wanted. All their courage and effort hadn't been enough to even delay her. The only reason they'd managed to escape was because Zuko had surprisingly chosen the good of the world over his own obsession. Who knew if they'd get so lucky next time? For the first time since their journey began they'd encountered someone who was just too powerful for them to overcome, and knowing that person had sworn to hunt them to the ends of the earth made them paranoid that she could leap out from the darkness at any moment. How do we stop her? Aang whispered miserably, huddling a little more into himself as the memory of those cold, golden eyes flashed through his memory. He felt so naive to have once believed that maybe she could have been a friend. Katara hummed gently, continuing to rub soothing circles on his back. Together. Maybe she is too much for us right now, but that won't be the case for long. Look at how quickly we mastered waterbending. Once you've mastered all 4 elements we'll face her again, and we won't be alone. Besides, nobody is invincible. Sokka chimed in, nudging him gently with his shoulder. Even the big bad Tanya has her weaknesses. We just have to figure out what they are. Weaknesses? Aang struggled to reconcile the girl who'd made the moon itself bleed with any sort of weakness. Roku warned me about her, back at the fire temple. He said she was something from outside the natural cycle of reincarnation, the agent of an invasive spirit from another world. What if she really is a demon like people say she is? Sokka snorted derisively. Sounds pretty accurate to me. Katara shot him an unimpressed look, but didn't speak up to deny it. But demon or not, Katara's right that you won't face her alone. Sokka continued, pulling him into a one-armed hug. We'll be right beside you all the way. Together. That was a comforting thought. Katara leaned into the hug as well, and the 3 of them enjoyed a brief moment of companionable silence as the last of Aang's tension untangled itself. No matter if the future held Zuko, Tanya, or the Fire Lord himself in store for them, they'd face the enemy together. Report that Agnikale has fallen, and with it the Northern Water Tribe's connection to the wider world. Although some resistance remains, it is not expected that Long Feng, the Grand Secretariat of Ba Sing Se and leader of the Dai Li, folded the letter up and dropped it on his desk, his face an impassive mask. The loss of yet another ally in this war was a problem, but also an opportunity in disguise. With the water tribes now truly out of the picture, only the Earth Kingdom and Fire Nation remained. If the Fire Nation exhausted itself against the Earth Kingdom's defenses, then the Earth Kingdom could at that point counterattack and regain all the territory they'd lost, then go on to take over the Fire Nation in the process. There was no obligation for them to return the other territories captured by the Fire Nation to their original owners at that point. The Earth Kingdom could become the one and only kingdom in the world, and all under the excuse of protecting themselves against the Fire Nation's aggression. Yet this Admiral Tanya could prove to be a huge thorn in that plan. If she could conquer the greatest city in the north on the night of a full moon, perhaps she might also be capable of breaking through the walls of Ba Sing Se. General Iroh had managed it once after all, and by all accounts this girl was just as clever a strategist as him, although far, far more ruthless. A countermeasure against her was needed. Long Feng stood and left his office, striding down the dark corridors of the hidden base beneath Lake Laogai. He passed row after row of heavy metals doors, many of which had flickers of lights and the muffled sounds of chanting spilling out from the cracks at the bottom, until he reached a door bigger than any other. Above the door hung a simple wooden sign with one word painted on it in bold red letters. Project Berserker. Years ago the military had stumbled across a miracle, a young earthbender girl with so much raw power that she had literally split a mountain in half before she'd even had a lick of training. To see her in action was like witnessing a natural disaster, a feat of strength only the Avatar could match. With discipline and guidance she could have been the Earth Kingdom's new super weapon. Yet, to everyone's great dismay, the girl hadn't shown so much as the slightest interest in learning how to control her powers, only how to unleash them against the Fire Nation. She was a walking wrecking ball of hate and fury, a mad berserker who just wanted to wildly throw her powers around and destroy whoever stood in her way. Long Feng had been patient for a year, given her time to realize the importance of proper discipline, but when the girl had still proven unwilling to even try to control herself he'd been forced to take extreme action. The girl was a double-edged sword after all, a walking disaster that could easily break open a hole in the walls with one of her temper tantrums. If she would not control herself, then for the good of the nation someone else would have to do it for her. And so one day one of his agents had slipped a sleeping drug into her drink, stolen her away to Lake Laogai, and Long Feng had covered up her disappearance with a story about her being sent away on a top-secret mission. Ever since then she had been confined to treatment within this room. Progress on her treatment had been unusually slow due to her stubborn nature, but recent reports had claimed to have made a breakthrough recently. Long Feng pushed open the heavy doors and stepped inside. The room was pitch black, devoid of any illumination, save for a dimly lit lantern that slowly spun around a metal track, revealing the room to be coated entirely with metal. Within the metal track sat 3 Dai Li agents dressed identically, and just outside, chained to a heavy iron chair, was a teenage girl with messy brown hair, her face pale, gaunt, and covered with sweat. "I'm Ju Di. Welcome to Ba Sing Se." The brainwashers intoned in unison. I'm Ju Di. Welcome to Ba Sing Se." The girl repeated. "We're so lucky to have our walls to create order. We're so lucky to have our walls to create order. There is no war in Ba Sing Se. There is no war in, no." The girl stumbled over her words, blinking rapidly as a flash of fury danced across her expression. "War. War. Tanya. I have to K*LL her. I swear I'll K*LL her. I'm Ju Di. Welcome to Ba Sing Se." The brainwashers repeated. "No." The girl roared. "I'm Mary. I'm Ju Di. Welcome to Ba Sing Se. The girl's voice broke into a sobbing gasp, and she shook her head. "I'm Ju Di. Welcome to Ba Sing Se. I'm Ju Di. Welcome to Ba Sing Se. I'm Ju Di. Welcome to Ba Sing Se." The brainwashers chanted over and over again, the lantern spinning ever onwards around them. The girl went still, her head dipping down like a puppet with its strings cut so that her messy hair covered her face. For a moment she was deathly still, but as the lantern rocked past her face she slowly tilted her head up again, revealing an eerily wide smile fixed across her lips. She stared back at her captors with glassy, vacant eyes, and when she spoke her voice had an emotionless, robotic tone to it. "I'm Ju Di. Welcome to BA Sing SE. Chapter 60. Ah! Now this is paradise. Zuko wanted to disagree with Uncle. He was in a furiously surly mood, and as a result half wanted everything around him to be awful just so that he'd have more things to complain about. Yet even he had to admit, somewhere deep in the back of his mind where it'd never be spoken out loud, that this was the best massage he'd ever had in his life. His family had employed the services of some of the finest masseuses back when he was a kid, but after years in exile, and more recently weeks being stranded at sea on a raft, his muscles had never been more sore. The skilled hands of the woman working on his back now eased knots in his muscles that had been there for so long that he'd forgotten what life had been like without them, and each spike and subsequent release of pressure sent waves of pleasure up his spine. It was impressive how Uncle had been able to charm their way into the spa. They'd washed up on the nearby beach with no money and nothing but the torn rags of their clothing, yet with just a smile, politeness, and a touch of flirting, Uncle had been able to charm the owner into letting them stay on promise of future payment. Though whether that payment would ever come or not, Zuko did not know. He had nothing left. No ship, no crew, no money. The only item he'd had on him during his quick escape from the north was the knife Uncle had once given him as a present, and he was unwilling to sell that except in the more dire of circumstances. Now more than ever he needed the inscription upon it. Never give up without a fight. The Avatar was still out there somewhere. Chances were that he'd made his way to the Earth Kingdom in search of a new master by now. If he could just capture him, everything he'd lost could still be restored. His father would let him come home and grant him an audience, and he could explain why he'd done what he'd done back at the North Pole. He wasn't a traitor, he just wasn't willing to execute children or risk damaging the natural order of the world for victory. Father would understand and forgive him. He had to. Of course Zuko still had to capture the Avatar first, with nothing but his own skill and the knife in his pocket. That wasn't going to be easy. Relax. The masseuse admonished gently, feeling him instinctively start to tense. You are one very serious young man. My nephew has a lot on his mind. Uncle answered for him. That's so? There's a festival in town tomorrow. Maybe you should go, help take your mind off things. Well, I do love a good festival. Uncle replied jovially. What's the occasion? It's in celebration of Admiral Tanya's victory. The masseuse answered. There's talk about making it a national holiday. Hey, relax will you? Zuko ignored the reprimand. That was another big problem. Tanya was the nation's golden girl right now, and it was obvious that she was going to do everything in her power to make his life a misery from now on. Father had always been fond of her, and would have no reason to deny audiences with her now that she was a part of his war council. Who knew what she might convince him to do? For all he knew she might be plotting her revenge right now, scheming new methods to take what little he had left away from him. For the last time, Captain, no. There's nothing I can do. Now stop complaining and get back to work. But Admiral, please. She said she was going to throw me overboard. Tanya let out a quiet sigh and forced back the urge to massage her temples. The captain was by no means an unintelligent man, and had done a decent job of running his ship so far, but decent just didn't cut it for Princess Azula. She demanded absolute obedience from the crew, and as close to perfection at all times as was humanly possible. Tanya didn't blame her, she herself paid great attention to her subordinates' training so that she could be assured they would act perfectly when the time required it. Azula's fault, however, was in demanding perfection in everything, every second of every day. It was stressing the crew out. This left Tanya in an unenviable position. As the princess of the nation and appointed commander of this mission, Azula's word was law. She could also be quite intimidating when she wanted to be, and suffered no complaints, which made the crew very uncomfortable about approaching her with questions or problems. Tanya however had a clear rank within the military hierarchy and experience commanding a ship, and as Azula's subordinate in this mission had taken it upon herself to handle the day-to-day running of the vessel in her stead. That meant that whenever anybody had an issue with Azula's orders they immediately came to Tanya about it, hoping that she could persuade the perfectionist princess to cut them some slack. She ordered me to ignore the tides and pull into port immediately. The captain continued incredulously. In shallow waters the bottom of the hull could be torn apart by rocks if we aren't careful. Then we'd better be careful then. An order is an order. Tanya shot back. I appreciate the risks involved, Captain, but we're out to capture prisoners of extremely high political importance. Any time we waste is time that they may use to slip away. I recommend you stop wasting time complaining to me, and start making the necessary preparations. Dismissed. The captain looked like he was sucking a lemon, but struck a curt salute and sulkily marched off. The moment he was out of sight, Tanya let out a deeper sigh, then stood up and strode down the corridors towards the royal quarters. It was stressful being the lightning vein for Angela's strict management style, but Tanya would endure it if it meant taking a little pressure off her friend's shoulders. If Angela was threatening to throw the captain into the ocean for complaining, then she was obviously a lot more on edge than she appeared to be. To look at the calm, confident expression she wore as she strutted around the ship like she owned the place, you would never guess that she was racked with guilt inside at the thought of imprisoning her own brother. Once she arrived at Angela's room, Tanya rapped on the door and waited for the call to enter. Once it came, she pushed the door open and took care to shut it behind her. "Your Highness," she greeted neutrally. Angela was reclining in a large, comfortable armchair, examining her nails as she filed them into sharp points. A caddish smirk crossed her lips as she looked over to Tanya. "What's the situation?" "We should be arriving within the hour," Tanya reported dutifully. "The rank-and-file soldiers are prepared and ready to depart as soon as we hit shore and block all exits out of the spa, and the elite team are all set to escort us in apprehending Zuko and Iroh. I've also had word sent to all nearby outposts and villages to stay alert for an old man and a teenager with a large burn over one eye, just in case." "How very thorough," Angela replied disinterestedly, her eyes returning to her nails. "Your military precision does you credit. Though I do wonder if perhaps it's unnecessary in this situation." Tanya raised an eyebrow. "How so?" "Zuzu is naive, and woefully desperate. Why drag them on board when we can get them to walk here willingly?" Angela blew on her nails and placed the file back on her dresser, making a show of being satisfied with her work. "I'll tell Zuko that father has changed his mind and has ended his banishment, and that I'm here to take him home. He'll be so desperate to get his old life back that he won't ask questions, and uncle will follow him wherever he goes." Tanya resisted the urge to smile. Angela thought she was playing it cool, but she could see through her. If Zuko came aboard willingly, there would be no need to fight him, which meant less chance of him being hurt by an overzealous soldier. That girl really was too considerate when it came to her big brother. Still, as the more seasoned commander of the two, it was her job to make sure that the more violent contingency plans were prepared just in case. A wise plan. It would be preferable to end this without a conflict if possible. "Still, I hope you don't mind if I have the soldiers take position around the spa anyway, just in case." Angela pursed her lips unhappily, doubtless worried by the thought of putting her family at any risk of harm, but eventually waved her hand dismissively. "Very well, I suppose it can't hurt. However, take care that your men don't arouse suspicion. In fact, you yourself had better stay hidden on the ship until we're far enough out at sea to prevent them from escaping. After what happened at the North Pole, I doubt even Zuko will believe that my intentions are peaceful if he sees you with me." "Yes, that did seem prudent." Tanya nodded in approval. "As you say. Very well, I'll circulate the new plan around the crew." "Wonderful." Angela shot her a thin smirk. "I don't know how I ever managed without you, Tanya. Keep this up and I may have to keep you in my service forever." Tanya chuckled in response and let a bright little smile cross her face. Even if Angela was just flattering her, it was nice to be appreciated. Maybe she could have applied for the post of Angela's royal guard if Oze hadn't already earmarked her for his new air marshal position. Spending nice lazy days lounging around the palace with Angela sounded like an eternal holiday. "We'll have to see if your father will let me once we return home successfully. Best of luck with the mission, Angela." With that she turned and left, completely missing the stormy expression on Angela's face. The moment the door was closed, Angela's scowl grew even more thunderous. "Little upstart!" she hissed to herself, glaring at the door as if blaming it for not collapsing atop her rival. Tanya had gotten too big for her boots ever since father had dangled the prize of being his right-hand woman in front of her. Even though Angela was one in charge around here, it hadn't stopped Tanya from taking it upon herself to talk with the crew and order them around, as if she was the boss and Angela just some VIP that needed escorting. Yet it also occurred to Angela that, should Uncle see through her deception and convince Zuko to try and flee, it would be Tanya who took all the credit for working out the logistics of the trap that caught them. That would all but assure her receiving father's promotion. Perhaps a little sabotage was in order? Just to make sure that, in case things didn't go Angela's way, they wouldn't go Tanya's way either.
Thanks for listening.